Cybercrime is a $6 trillion economy. It has surpassed drug trafficking as the number one crime. The CEO is responsible for cybersecurity and the board are accountable. My name is Paul Dwyer, and for over 30 years, I have worked with military, law enforcement, and organizations like yours in order to protect digital assets from cyber threat actors. In this briefing, we're going to learn and share all the salient pieces of knowledge you need in order to be able to deliver an appropriate cyber strategy to protect your organization. The material we're going to reference is an abstract from the Certified Cyber Risk Officer course. We have 10 segments. In the first segment, we're going to look at the cyber risk landscape itself. Then we're going to look at the underground economy of cybercrime, how it actually operates, the different kind of players, the different actors, and their various motivations. We'll then delve into what we refer to as the fifth domain, that is to say cyber warfare, nation-state involvement, and we will look at the blurred lines between organised criminal groups and nation-state actors. Then we'll take some time to look at the cyber risk impact from COVID-19 itself and how it has impacted that dynamic cyber risk landscape. Then we're going to uncover the anatomy of a cyber attack. We'll look at what we refer to as the cyber kill chain, the 10 key stages that are involved in an attacker circumventing the controls within an organization for a successful attack. Then we'll switch gears a little bit and we'll look at how we can develop a cyber strategy specifically for an organization. We'll look at areas such as CRQ, cyber risk quantification. That is to say, putting metrics, meaningful metrics in relation to the risks identified so that you can make intelligence-led, informed decisions around risk and the residual risk that's been identified in relation to any particular threats. Then we'll delve a little bit deeper again. We'll go into cyber governance and oversight, and we'll look at how you can control, monitor, and have accountability around all of this area. We'll conclude by looking at the G7 cyber fundamentals. These are the fundamental pieces of advice that have been provided as guidance from the G7, the group of 7 countries, to all financial organizations, large and small, around the world. And finally, in the shadow of the words of Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, we will focus in on those words where Christine Lagarde warned the industry that because of that interconnected and interdependent nature of the financial sector, that a significant cyber attack could cause a liquidity crisis. That contagion or knock-on effect is something we all have to be aware of, and we all have to take some responsibility in dealing with that risk. So we're going to focus in on 10 key actions you can take in order to understand and to improve your level of cyber resilience. So let's begin. First, we're going to look at the cyber risk landscape. And in order for us to understand the different threat actors and the different types of groups that we face from a cyber threat perspective, we need to understand the concept that we actually live in 2 different worlds. We live in the real world, that's the real physical world. That's the law with laws, social norms, and consequences to crime, or when somebody breaks those rules of society. And then we also live in the cyber world, and that's a completely different kind of world. So let me give you an example of this that might illustrate some of the differences. So for example, if I'm a criminal, if I'm a bad actor, and I want to steal something in the real physical world, the first thing I need to get proximity to the asset that I'm going to steal. So let's use, for example, the idea of stealing a laptop. I would have to get physically close to that laptop. I would have to get my hands on it, take the laptop, evade capture and steal the laptop in some sort of inconspicuous way. And then I have stolen the asset. I've stolen that laptop. Now, when it comes to the world of cybercrime and cyber criminals, the criminal, the bad actor, the cyber threat actor, just needs to be able to access the asset from a distance. They don't need to physically get access to that asset. So they can be sitting anywhere in the world and they can operate with almost impunity to access the asset, hack into it, get a copy of that data. And the asset in most cases is data. Data is the new cash. So if we think of that example of stealing a laptop, a physical laptop, well, the first thing is you would notice that your laptop is stolen if you're the victim. And if your laptop is stolen, you would raise the alarm. There'd be an investigation. Perhaps somebody would have some evidence, maybe some CCTV. Maybe law enforcement would be involved. Maybe you have transferred the risk of losing that asset to an insurance company. All of these things are the reality of dealing with the risk of crime in the real physical world. And there could be an investigation, there could be attribution, that's to say that the bad actor, the criminal, would be identified, brought to court, and face the consequences of their actions. But again, let's flip this over to the world of cybercrime. It is completely different. Generally, you won't even know that your asset has been stolen because you'll still have access to it. That is to say, you'll still have access to the data. You'll still be working with it. You might even know that it's changed or that it's been accessed or compromised in some way. And certainly, if there is an investigation, it's only in very, very, very few circumstances is there attribution. Is the bad guy, if you like, identified? Do they face courts? Do they face justice? Because this is it's a transnational crime, and it's something that is borderless. The internet is a flat landscape from the point of view of a criminal can be sitting anywhere. You may be sitting in London, they may be sitting in South America, Russia, whatever, and they can access systems from anywhere. And so therefore, this is one of the aspects that has proliferated cybercrime, criminality, and the various cyber threat vectors that we're going to talk about in this segment. So let's understand a little bit about the financial sector when it comes to cyber threats. Well, the G7, that is the group of 7 countries, as they get together on a regular basis to discuss what's happening in the world and what are the big issues. And they've called it out to say that cyber risks are growing more dangerous and diverse, threatening to disrupt our interconnected global financial systems. And this, of course, is on the basis of, let's call them near misses. Things like what they're often referred to as the SWIFT hack, which wasn't really the SWIFT system being hacked, but it was a large compromise. And I suppose the financial sector dodged a bullet in many ways in what happened in relation to those kind of attacks. And this has even been called out, as we will discuss, by the president of the European Central Bank and so on. The reality that the financial sector is made up of large and small entities, and they are interconnected and interdependent, and an attack on one could potentially have an impact on all because of a contagion kind of an effect. So there is this reality that each part of the financial sector is interdependent and interconnected. And that's something we have to accept and realize, especially when it comes to cyber threats. It's no point in saying, well, my house is in order, everything is okay, but actually you're dealing with business partners, you're dealing with vendors, and you're dealing with customers ultimately as well. And all of those things in the information society means that we have to exchange and transfer information on a regular basis. And all of those transactions bring with them a certain level of cyber risk. And the industry itself is based on the concept of trust. Gone is obviously the fiat system, so to speak, in relation to the validity of effectively account balances being backed by gold and so on. And really what we're into is the trust of brands, the trust of reputations, and people understanding and trusting the digitalization of banking and the financial sector itself. So it's more important than ever that we absolutely get this right when it comes to cyber risk management. And when we look at the transition from real-world crime and real-world physical criminality, it tends to have an aspect of violence. In other words, the entry level or the entry card, if you like, to the world of criminality was based on your propensity or ability to be violent, and it's something that has a huge ability to bring people into that world, and their entry card, if you like, their kudos, their bona fides, is based on how violent they are or their reputation around violence. However, it's completely different when it comes to the world of cybercrime. Because when it comes to the world of cybercrime, it's really about what can you do. It's almost a meritocracy of crime. And a lot of these individuals never meet each other in the real world. They're not from legacy families of criminality. They're simply people that can carry out a particular digital piece of work, if you like, in relation to it. It could be crafting a phishing email. It could be performing a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack. It could be any aspect in relation to a crime itself. And that is one of the main reasons why the underground economy of cybercrime is now estimated to be a $6 trillion economy. It's why the organized crime groups, the OCGs, have become very, very highly vested in this area of criminality, because we've got different levels of criminals operating in this area, from our low-level script kiddies all the way up to our OCG groups around the world. And it has surpassed drug trafficking as the #1 crime in the world. Let's have a look at this infographic for a moment. And here what we can see are the main types of cyber threat actor groups. This is not all of them. This is just the main groups. But what's really interesting on this infographics is to see that they all have different kinds of objectives. So if we start at the top right-hand side here and we look at cyber criminals, they tend to have an objective is to make money. They want to make profit. They're entrepreneurs. They're business people. They invest into criminal projects and they want to have an ROI, return on their investment. And they're very motivated to make money from whatever criminal activity that they make. And it's really important to understand when it comes to thwarting their attacks, their nefarious objectives and so on, to understand that it's all about making it difficult for them, because if it's not cost effective, they will move on. Then we have nation states. These are the states that condone or harbor cyber criminals in many cases because they want to use their skills for their own nefarious purposes. And indeed, they may have their own military units that they use in order to carry out cyber threat related activities in relation to geopolitical aspects. And then, of course, we have hacktivists. So what's a hacktivist? A hacktivist is essentially somebody that's an activist but is using hacking capabilities or cyber threat capabilities in order to carry out or support their own ideology. So an example of that may be organizations that are against animal cruelty, that kind of activity where they have an ideology that they want to push, and the modern day version of placards is maybe to carry out a DDoS attack or to destroy or deface a particular website, whatever it happens to be. And then, of course, we have terrorist groups. And terrorist groups are using the whole underground ecosystem of cyber criminals in order to be able to carry out their activities, because terrorist activity requires money. It also requires being able to be covert. It also requires being able to perhaps groom, radicalize, spread propaganda, and spread fear to the wider community. And they will use this ecosystem to do that. And then we have the ones that tend to make the media quite a bit, which are thrill seekers. And thrill seekers generally want to do it basically for the fun of it. They want to do it because they get kudos. They may be somebody that is, in many cases, they're victims of cybercrime themselves, insofar as that they are often groomed by the organizers of criminal activity. But these are often sometimes vulnerable children who may be on the spectrum, may suffer with conditions such as Asperger's syndrome and so on. And they have these brilliant brains which are then being used for nefarious reasons because they're being coerced or manipulated into doing things. And in many cases, when we look at these thrill seekers, they really don't see that they've done anything wrong, because what they've done is almost, in their eyes, an extension of online game playing. And it's been so easy in many cases for them to carry out an attack on a website that doesn't feel like an attack. It just feels like a game that you're making something do something it shouldn't do, like spit out all of the data onto the web or download all of the data from that aspect. And finally, we have another group, which we call the cyber insiders. And the cyber insiders are generally the discontent, but not always. And remember, this is a very important group because they can cause you more damage and have more impact because they're effectively inside. And when we think of how security architecture is put together, when we consider how all our defenses are generally put together from a cybersecurity program perspective, we tend to want to keep the bad guys out. And so we put all the defenses there, and the premise is that the bad guys outside the firewall, they're not inside our walls or our network. But in the case of an insider, they may be sitting at a desk. They may have access to your corporate network, which means that they are trusted somewhat. And that trust means that you're more vulnerable because they're able to see things they wouldn't necessarily see if they were an outsider. Now, I alluded that there may be a couple of different types of cyber insiders, and there are. There are the discontent that maybe sometimes they didn't get a job that they wanted, or they feel they were being mistreated by their employer, and they may want to do some damage for some particular reason. But then there's the others. There's the ones that themselves are actually maybe a victim of a romance scam or a sextortion scam, and they're being coerced into doing something. And a romance scam is where they have been groomed online into a fake romance, and they may have shared some embarrassing images or text, whatever, and the threat is made that this will be shared in the wider community, perhaps with somebody's spouse or within the business itself, unless they collude unless they cooperate and do something from within inside the camp. So that is generally those different kind of groups. Now, what you want to consider in this infographic is your adversary is right in the middle. So think of this like a Venn diagram. Think of this that all of these are overlapping and they all work together. And that's the reality of cyber threat actors. They all work together. They all work within the same ecosystem. So cyber criminals work with nation states work with thrill seekers because they're all sharing resources. They're all sharing capability and they hop from one project to another all the time. So if you're fighting or trying to defend your systems against somebody stealing your data, you're also fighting against terrorism. You're also fighting against organized crime. You're also fighting against nation states who may be trying to hack in or circumvent the critical national infrastructure of a country. So what are they after? Well, the reality is they're after the kitchen sink. And in a previous slide deck, that's exactly the image I used to use, a kitchen sink here, because they're really after everything that they can get their hands on, because everything has an intrinsic value. They're after access to systems. They may target your employees. They may target your suppliers. They may target your customers, because they want to find that route. They want to find that route into your systems, into your data, into your intellectual property, into all of the data that is valuable to them, because the data can be sold many times, and the data can go into an exponential value when it's correlated with other pieces of data, because it may be able to be used as part of other more sophisticated and complex scams. So what we've got here, guys, is a cat and mouse game. And it's like, I often say that criminality and cyber criminality is old stuff done in a new way. And that's exactly what we're dealing with. And from, the first law enforcement agencies in the world, it's always been a cat and mouse game with the bad guys. And that's what it is today. So as the defenses are increased, as we invest and develop innovative solutions such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on, so too are the bad guys. And they're also developing their own systems, and they're highly sophisticated and well funded. One particular group that we've been surveilling recently has 650 bitcoins in a wallet that they haven't touched. And the only time they use that money, which has been a result of ransomware attacks, and the only time that they use that money is when they're building more ecosystem for themselves. They're building global corporations. They have marketing departments, support departments, everything else, and they are big players. So let's have another look at this infographic from a different perspective. And from this, what I want you to really take is the fact that there's a different sophistication or skill level to your cyber threat actor. Now, again, there are blurred lines, guys. This is not about just simply everybody fits neatly into a swim lane. On one side, we have here on the left, we've got thrill seekers. Their objective is fun. They may use things like phishing and malware, and fairly low skilled. We often refer to these guys as script kiddies, and that essentially means that they're using scripts to do a lot of the work. They're not actually command line and being able to really hack in a very complex or technical way. But let's look over on the right-hand side for a moment. These are very highly skilled individuals. They may be Chinese hackers who use APTs. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. APTs are advanced persistent threats. They may target things like industrial control systems, SCADA-based systems, and they may be looking for a geopolitical or economic advantage. So you've got a whole spectrum of players, a whole spectrum of cyber threat actors and bad actors with different sophistication levels and different motivations and different objectives. So I mentioned there the underground economy of cybercrime. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Firstly, I want to talk about the dark web. So many of you would have heard about this, but maybe not familiar with exactly what it is. So first, I want to talk about the surface web. The surface web is effectively the internet that we all know and enjoy. That's essentially the websites that you can find through a search engine such as Google, such as Bing. You type in what you're looking for, and it trawls through an index and it finds a particular website. It lists them. You can click on it and go directly to that website. All very straightforward. The reality is, though, that search engine is only indexing a tiny portion of the internet. The rest of the internet is what we often refer to as the deep web. That is to say, it's the rest of the internet that is not indexed. And it's not indexed for many reasons. I mean, it may be that it's behind a paywall. It may be behind an academic network, whatever it happens to be. And it's something that's just not publicly available, but it's on the internet and connected to the internet. Now, part of that is often referred to as the dark web. And the reality is that this deep web, dark web relationship is really based on the fact that this area of the internet is maybe 95% of the real internet, and we only get about 5% through search engines such as Google and such as Bing. So let me talk a little bit more detail now about the dark web and where this came from. So we have the reality in the world is that there's agencies all over the world that surveil different entities, and they're sometimes military units, sometimes intelligence units, and one of those entities is the United States Navy. And the United States Navy would be carrying out intelligence-led analysis, i.e., for many would refer to that as spying, on different entities and organizations around the world. And what they realized was that when they're visiting various websites and so on, that they were being easily identified that they were visiting the website based on their IP addresses, based on device recognition and so on. So they developed this really clever piece of software known as Tor, T-O-R, the onion router. And what the onion router allowed them to do was it was able to obfuscate their identity, their IP address, and it was able to hide that and bounce that effectively around the world. So if you've ever seen any of those TV programs where someone's trying to trace a telephone call and say, oh, they weren't done long enough, or they were bouncing the signal around the world, or whatever it happened to be, it's that kind of premise, guys. It's the fact that they've made it very difficult to find out where the original entry came from the person that is making the connection to the website on the internet. But they realized that Tor was based on an unstandard protocol on the internet. So therefore, people would still realize that this was the United States Navy using this unstandard protocol on the internet and visiting their websites and surveilling them and so on. So what the United States Navy decided to do was they would give this software away for free to the world, and everybody could use it. Now, this isn't as mad as it sounds, because the reality was that that's really good for oppressed dissidents, journalists that need to stay anonymous and be able to protect themselves and hide themselves. But of course, there's a flip side of this, guys, which is all the bad guys took this for nefarious reasons. And everything from pedophiles, predators online, criminals, terrorists, everything have all started to use this on a regular basis. And they are able to create effectively this sub-internet known as the dark web, or these hidden services that you can only access by going through this Tor software and being able to access it. So it's meant that there's this whole other underground world of these marketplaces, these connected resources of bad guys with nefarious intentions that are able to evade capture in most cases and be able to stay as anonymous. So it's like an invisibility cloak on the internet that these people can put on when they're accessing websites, when they're carrying out their objectives. So a lot of you may be familiar with terms like Silk Road, and the fact that the websites can be used for buying guns, buying drugs, and so on. Here are a couple of snapshots from genuine parts of the dark web. And here we have, for example, Silk Road, which was a very famous marketplace, turned over $1 billion in its first year. Yes, $1 billion. You did hear that correctly. Here we can see that you can buy fake currency, you can buy guns, you can buy endangered species like the pangolin. Here we have terrorists groups operating there and organizing and sending propaganda and so on. In the bottom left is a very interesting one, because that's stock insiders and the number of insider trading sites that have been set up on the dark web is growing at a huge rate. And they tend to charge minimum of $100,000 to join, or you can swap verified information in order to be able to come in and be able to get access to other information. So and of course there's lots of sites selling drugs. But of course, in the big red box here, guys, what are we looking at? We're looking at a murder for hire. website, where the prices are based on whether it's a regular person, a public person, how many guards they have. And you can see it's a price list. Do you want them crippled? Do you want them raped, bombing, beatings, whatever it happens to be? So it's that kind of environment. And this is just to give you an example, not to shock you, but to give you an example of the kind of individuals and people that are on on these various marketplaces and websites within the dark web itself. Finally, this is just an infographic showing some of the prices around human organs, because this is about cyber evil guys. These guys are not just about selling data and making money. If they can ship a human over or a part of a human and make money, then they will do that too. So we're in a very, very dark territory as regards what goes on the dark web itself. Now, let's go back to, if you like, this kind of cyber criminal who's after data. And it may be when we hear media reports all the time of X million records being stolen, X million passwords being stolen, but why is there such an insatiable demand for this data? And the reality is that these marketplaces, they act almost like stock exchanges where there's different values on assets all the time that are being sold. And the value of the asset is dependent on a number of factors, including how fresh it is. Because just like selling fruit in the market, the price will go down the longer it's been out. So if somebody has been a target or a victim of a cybercrime and they've lost 100,000 records, that will have its highest value within the first few hours, and the value will go down, because obviously people will then change passwords, they'll change account numbers, all of those good things, and they know the value goes down. So there's this ongoing value. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that it's a bit like an underground stock exchange, because you will see the prices change all the time. And a lot of these marketplaces do not look unlike the likes of an eBay, where you will see a rating based on the person selling it. And they also work through what we call an escrow system, because it's axiomatic that one criminal can't trust another criminal on the other side of the world. The marketplaces themselves act as a middle, as a conduit, as a middle person on the transaction, and they will take a cut for validating the integrity of the data that has been stolen. Now, who makes up this underground economy of cybercrime? Well, let's look at some of the key players here. So I'm going to start on the bottom left and we'll work our way around clockwise. So we have hosted system providers. These are the entities and organizations that provide, if you like, the technical architecture and ecosystem that can be used, because they don't always operate off hacked systems. Sometimes what they'll do, and often they'll use, are systems that they will rent and hire from companies who set themselves up to provide architecture and systems to criminals. These are often referred to as bulletproof hosting, and they're the kind of hosting providers that will provide cover and provide hidden hosting and safe hosting systems for criminality, so illicit material, those kind of things. Then we have cashiers. They are the ones who control drop accounts and provide names and accounts to other criminals for a fee. We have money mules. Some of them are witting and some of them are unwitting money mules. And by that I mean some of them know that they're being money mules, and some of them operate in the real physical world where they'll go up to ATMs and take out money. Others are getting money transferred through their account. Often we find that students are caught up into scams where they're unwittingly become money mules, or people that fall for these work from home scams, and they think they're working for an overseas company that hasn't yet opened up in their region, and they will let the money go into their own personal account and then transfer it on by Western Union or whoever. And in those kind of cases, we often have unwitting money mules who have become victims themselves. We have the tellers. They're the ones who are charged with transferring and laundering the illicitly gained proceeds through digital and cryptocurrency services and different world currencies. They'll often use things like tumblers and mixers to obfuscate and be able to hide this money laundering that's going on between even cryptocurrencies themselves. Now, the next one is quite an interesting one. These are the organization leaders. These are often people persons. They often don't have any technical skills, but they can assemble the team and choose the target. They're the organizers. They're the project leaders, if you like. They're the Mr. and Ms. Big of the world of cybercriminality, and they will pull together these ad hoc flash teams that they'll use to carry out a particular project or particular attack on an organization. And then, of course, we have programmers. So we've got programmers on the dark side too, guys. We've got the ones who develop the exploits and malware to commit the crimes. This is often called malware, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. And then we have distributors. And the reason I highlight these is because we need to understand that it's a sophisticated model, just like how retail works in the real world, where you might have a distributor, you may have wholesalers, and you have retailers. You have exactly the same in the criminal world. Think of the example where maybe a low-level cyber criminal has just made away with 500,000 account details. Well, they're not going to use those 500,000 account details themselves, because they'll just never get through 500,000 accounts in being able to try to do something with them. So they'll sell those off to a distributor, and that distributor will break up that list and sell it off to wholesalers, and those wholesalers will then break it up further and sell it off to individual, what we call retail cyber criminals, who may want a list of, let's say, for example, they want what we call fulls data, FULLZ. Fulls data is your full account data, and they might want the billing address and so on of a current account with a balance of over 50,000 euros in it, but they might just want 100 accounts like that. And they will pay a larger fee. So they might pay $40, $50 per account and be able to get those, because they're going to carry out some sort of scam targeting people with over 50,000 euros in their account and have all their billing addresses, have all their usernames, maiden names, all that kind of things that would be used for to circumvent the security in those accounts. And then, of course, we have tech experts. They're the guys and girls who maintain the criminal enterprise's IT infrastructure, including the servers, encryption, technology, databases, and so on. These are the people that water and feed the servers, take care of that infrastructure, make sure things are patched, because guys, criminals don't want to fall victim to crime. So they make sure they're patched, they make sure they're very secure, and that they have a high level of security in place. So they have the right kind of engineers involved. And then, of course, there's hackers. Hackers are the ones who will search for and exploit the applications, the systems, and the network vulnerabilities. These are often, as I've already mentioned, very talented, almost naive children in many cases that are being manipulated because they like to do this kind of stuff. They like to hack. We often say hackers are born, they're not created. So it's the kind of brilliant brain that wants to tinker with things, play with things, and pull them apart. They don't always have a nefarious or dark intention, but that doesn't mean that they don't become part of this. And we often see this when it comes to attribution in relation to cybercriminals being charged. It's the low-hanging fruit. It's the often very young children in many cases that are identified and end up on front of judges and courts to talk about their part in maybe in a major cyber crime. And finally, there are fraudsters, those who create and deploy the various social engineering schemes such as phishing and spam. So again, this is just the top 10 roles. It's not all of them, but it's to give you a flavor, give you an idea of the sophistication of this marketplace and the different kind of players that are in there making up this economy. Now, I mentioned crimeware. So what exactly is crimeware? Well, crimeware is software specifically designed to carry out a criminal activity. If we go back 10, 15 years and talk about hackers, we would have been talking about somebody who was effectively, quote unquote, a nerd, somebody that could, hack in through systems. They knew all about network security, they knew about application level security, all those kind of things. They had to be very skilled, and highly experienced in being able to do that. Now, crimeware is where they've developed software that can do all of those kind of things for you with a beautiful user interface to the software. Makes it really easy to do. So whether you want to carry out a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack, or a ransomware attack, that's where you can effectively encrypt or kidnap the data of an organization and only give it back if they pay a ransom. You can rent or buy the tools. So renting it is what we call CAAS, that's crime as a service, or you can buy the tools and do it yourself. And this again works on a profit sharing scheme. So if you rent, say for example, crimeware to carry out a ransomware attack, you may find that you pay a specific fee, but also a percentage of the ransoms that are paid will also go to the developer of the tools as well, the crimeware tools. So you can see how very quickly this economy feeds itself and how it is estimated to be surpass a $6 trillion economy at this stage. So ransomware, we're seeing a huge proliferation in ransomware attacks, and we can argue and debate about why the reason for that is, but really it comes down to this. Criminals do whatever works. And if ransomware is working, then they'll put all their effort into that. And what criminals and cyber criminals realized not too long ago was that insurance companies were paying ransoms in relation to ransomware. So all of a sudden they demanded higher ransoms, and it went from $1,000 to 10,000. Now it is not uncommon for ransoms to be demanded that are seven figures in size, and we can see that even in the rules of engagement between the conversations on nation state to nation state are around ransomware, because this is such a horrible, devastating attack on organizations and critical national infrastructure, whether you're an oil pipeline, whether you're a medical facility, whether you're a school, whether you're a bank, whatever it happens to be. It is devastating if you can't access your data and you're able to operate. And it just seems to be so easy when it comes down to this, and we're making it so easy in many cases for these ransomware attacks to be successful. And embarrassingly for law enforcement around the world, even they become victims of ransomware and have had to pay ransoms to get their data back. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about mixers and tumblers because I mentioned it there. And mixers and tumblers are effectively a modern day version of being able to support the laundering of cryptocurrencies. So cryptocurrency is the currency of choice for example, ransomware payments or a lot of criminal activity. It's not always Bitcoin. And in many cases, they don't want to use Bitcoin because in many cases Bitcoin can be traced, but they will actually use these services called mixers and tumblers, where party A wants to send a Bitcoin to party B, but there's another party there, C, and C has put in a Bitcoin that wants to go to party D, but they will mix across. So A's coin goes to C and C goes to B, and they mix through. And there's a percentage charge on the Bitcoin value as it goes through this system, and then you can't trace a Bitcoin going from party A to party B because it never went there at the end of the day, and there's no connection between those two entities. So it's quite sophisticated how it works, it's quite successful, and it's quite lucrative for the players in that space because they're able to launder at a great scale. Now let's look at the cybercrime price list. Now, this infographic we put together to give you an idea, a concept of the kind of things and the kind of prices that are being paid for services, for data and attack tools in the underground economy of cybercrime. Now, these prices change and fluctuate all the time, so these are just indicative prices, but it does give you a good idea. And if we look on the left side, I've broken these into three streams. We've got attack tools, we've got data in the middle, and services on the right-hand side. So whether we want to order some malware and attack tools or ransomware software or payments, or whether we want to steal data or order data to be stolen, we can do that, or whether we want to get fake documents or hire a service for a DDoS attack or a spam campaign, whatever it happens to be, all of those things are available. So this is just to give you a flavor and an idea of the different kinds of things that are available in the underground economy of cybercrime. So I talked a little bit there about geopolitics and so on. So I want to talk a little bit more in depth about that particular subject. So we're going to talk about now is what we refer to as the fifth domain, cyber warfare, and those blurred lines that exist between criminality and warfare. So what does the fifth domain mean? Well, effectively it was a phrase coined by The Economist magazine when they talked about the fact that warfare now exists in land, sea, air, space, and now cyberspace being the fifth domain of warfare. Now, there's lots of debate around whether cyber warfare is something real, whether it's actually happening, and so on. But I'll put it this way. If you can demonstratively see that nation states are attacking private organizations, critical national infrastructure, not just surveilling, but attacking, how is that not a form of warfare that's going on? And there's lots of examples, unfortunately, of that kind of activity going on. And I want to talk a little bit about it so that we can understand how what's going on, the link to geopolitics, and effectively how you can hopefully not become collateral damage in these kind of attacks as well. So in the recent summit meeting between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, one of the first topics they talked about was cyber warfare. and that really positions how important this is as a topic. And what they were trying to do was essentially set ground rules between what was allowed and what was not allowed, or what was going to be tolerated, or what was not going to be tolerated, especially in light of things like the ransomware attacks that I've mentioned, in light of things like attacks on critical national infrastructure and so on. That was really important to set some sort of terms across this. And we'll give some examples about further in right that's so important for the financial sector itself. So this is something, guys, that is genuinely very real. It's something that happens all the time. And it's really based on the premise of you don't need to drop bombs on a country to control it. If you can control their critical national infrastructure, if you can control their water, their gas, their electricity, their airspace, by compromising their computer systems, then you don't need to be able to move in the traditional formats of warfare. And they often use what we refer to as APTs, very surgical attacks. And an APT, that acronym is short for Advanced Persistent Threat. And these are generally based on what we call zero-day vulnerabilities. So what's a zero-day vulnerability? A zero-day vulnerability is essentially a vulnerability that is not known. So it's unknown. It's on the 0 day. Nobody knows about this vulnerability, a weakness, a flaw in a system, a way to compromise or control a piece of software or a piece of architecture, and it's not known about. Now, if you know that, and you know that vulnerability, well, you in a bug bounty program with a legitimate organization, you may get rewards for sharing that information. If you're a criminal, you may get $100,000 or up to $250,000 for selling that vulnerability. So they're very valuable pieces of information to know. However, when we see these ones coming from a nation state perspective, what we see is that they often use a number of these vulnerabilities, 5, 6, 7 of these unknown 0 day vulnerabilities to become part of these advanced persistent threat attack vectors and what they carry out. So think of it like a very advanced piece of malware, but at the end of the day, behind every piece of malware is a person or an individual or an entity that wants to carry this out. And these APTs often combined with physical kind of attack vectors, like compromising somebody in the real physical world as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So I want to talk very quickly about Stuxnet. And Stuxnet was probably for many one of the key iconic milestones in relation to cyber warfare. And this is when there was the Iranian nuclear enrichment facility was many, many meters underground in an area of a desert called Natanz. And yet it was able to be, even though it was air gapped, that's to say it wasn't connected to the internet, it was able to be compromised. And that's because there was a piece of malware, if you like, or we often refer to this as code warfare. There's a piece of software designed that would simply look for a particular piece of industrial apparatus. In this case, it was a Siemens device that was being used in order to enrich the uranium. And when it found that particular environment, that particular unique signature, it would then activate and it would carry out its activity. And what it was able to do was able to spin those centrifuges much faster than they should, give up false error and reports up onto a screen so that the engineers that were looking at this had no idea what was going on. And it effectively, to put it in a nutshell, knocked back the Iranian nuclear program by at least 6 months. And the dogs on the street would believe that this was put together by the Americans and the Israelis. And it was a joint project to take down the Iranian nuclear program. And it was highly effective. But it was also highly demonstrable of the fact of how powerful something like this could be. This piece of malware was out there in the wild for a long time, and it would just sniff around looking for it until it was in the environment before it would activate and do what it needed to do. Now, you might feel that this is something that's laudable, but the reality is that these are often boomerangs that come back at the person who threw the device in the first place. So in the case of Stuxnet, the code for that is obviously now available out on open source. Different variants of it, different aspects of it are able to be regenerated and being used to attack other systems and other industrial control systems around the world. But For those of you who have an interest in it, you might want to look into more about Stuxnet itself, but it was a very powerful piece of malware that was used effectively for a cyber warfare maneuver. And this is what they're trying to attack, guys, at the end of the day. Critical national infrastructure, the backbone of our society. We're talking about systems that were designed to be available, not necessarily secure. When we look at securing an asset, we often talk about the CIA triad. That's the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the asset. Can we make it confidential? Can we make sure nothing's changing? Can we make sure it's available? But when it comes to industrial control systems and SCADA-based systems, it was the reverse. It was AIC. Make sure systems go down. The last point was, can we keep it secure? Can we keep it confidential? Because nobody ever thought that somebody would want to hack into a train system and make two trains go towards each other on a train track, or to poison a water system. Nobody ever thought that. So these systems were never designed. They were designed to be foolproof, so that mistakes wouldn't happen, easy to use. And what that's meant now for any of these systems that can be compromised is that they can carry out a devastating impact on society itself. From our home perspective, we have the equivalent in our homes that we bring home every day with the Internet of Things, these devices that we bring home that are not designed to be secure, that we put on our home network, and all of these things are easily compromised. And it's great to see that there's new legislation coming in the UK and other regions around the world that is tackling this issue and forcing a level of security to be put into these kind of devices before we bring them to our homes. Because the reality is these things are painfully insecure. And if you want to find out more about that, you can go to a website, for example, like Shodan. And Shodan is a website that effectively index everything that isn't that's on the internet but isn't secure, if you like, from the point of view that it's not a website. It's looking for things like everything from traffic lights to nanny cams to CCTV cameras, any device, even printers, even databases that are sitting up in the cloud, anything that has an IP address and speaks on the internet and can't be found through Google or Bing or your favorite search engine, you'll probably find it on Shodan. Now, what does that mean at the end of the day? Well, what it means is, if you've put in something like a CCTV system and you have the default username and the default password that came with a manufacturer and you haven't changed it, and somebody can click on that and they know the manufacturer model comes up and they put in admin as the password as well, and they're in. They might as well be sitting there, and then they can turn on the microphone, switch off the camera, do whatever they want. And that's the reality. And when people see that come to life on something like Shodan, they're amazed. I mean, here on this slide, we can see a map of the United States and all the different kinds of devices, because you can actually search just by your area, just around your own home, just around your own neighborhood, what kind of devices are speaking on the internet and are they available. And to be quite honest and quite startling, it's frightening. So a little bit more about these APT groups. I mean, I don't want to sound judgmental on one side or the other, because I will say that lots of different nations do this for various different reasons. Generally, you know, the top sort of bad guys that are called out in this, quote unquote, to use that phrase, are Russia and China. China effectively has a military campaign based on their 5-year plans, and they use a group called Unit 61398, which is a military unit, full uniformed soldiers of the People's Liberation Army, and their job to come in every day with national pride is to attack systems around the world and companies around the world. And here we see on the insert, we have a slide as most wanted by the FBI, because this again is geopolitical posturing, where the Americans put out warrants for the arrest of some of these military people and it's like trying to arrest a soldier for doing their job. So it's a crazy new world we're in, where the rules are blurred to how to handle this from a geopolitical point of view as well. And here's an example that we can see, and I really use this example just to highlight that relationship between the real world and the physical world. The most sophisticated and the most mature chief information security officers and cybersecurity departments that I come across in the financial sector are the ones that have individuals that understand geopolitics. Because whatever happens in the real world around geopolitics instantly has an impact on what's happening from a cyber threat perspective. And what we often see, for example, is if something, for example, in the real physical world, there was maybe physical posturing around the Ukraine, and the Americans may say something, then what you'll see is activity like this. You will see financial service companies in the United States being hit with attacks from all over the world. They won't necessarily see that the origin has been directly from Russia, but we will see this kind of activity. And these are warning shots. These are shots across the bow from nation states to say, enough's enough. Remember what we can do. Do you really want to escalate this? So this is like a shoving match, a cyber shoving match that goes on between nations. But of course, legitimate companies can get caught in the middle of that almost as collateral damage. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about terrorism because I mentioned it briefly in relation to our overview of the cyber threat actors. But the reality is terrorists need money. The reality is that they need a way to organize their activities and so on. And, we've uncovered within the ICTTF itself, and what we've been very vocal on identifying the link between, for example, groups like Al-Qaeda and cyber criminal activity. And for example, even the attacks on London Bridge that were carried out were financed by business email compromise scams that were being carried out. That's invoice scams, effectively, in cyber criminality. And those groups were highly related to that and those kind of activities. So there's a direct link between terrorist activities and criminality as well. The cyber risk impact of COVID. So, the elephant in the room is COVID and the global pandemic, and let's discuss some of the impacts that that's had in relation to cyber risk. Firstly, we often refer to something like this as a black swan event from a risk perspective, i.e. it's something that we never expected, but therefore it's now something that's become the expected, something that's almost normal to us. And a black swan event can often be categorized with cyber events such as large-scale ransomware attacks and so on. Things that we thought, yes, conceptually it could happen, but we don't think it will ever happen. But the reality is it does, and it now becomes quite normal. So it's good to think of this when you consider things like cyber risks and cyber threats and the reality of the world we live in, because they're evolving all the time as well. So let's look at the impact of COVID. Well, firstly, it's caused chaos in the global economy. It has disrupted supply chains. It's transformed society, how we operate, wearing masks, sanitization, everything in relation to how we operate as human beings and businesses has transformed. It has accelerated the business models of organizations. So this acceleration of business model transformation is something that I'm going to explore a little bit further as we go through this, because it's a huge, almost positive from this. But with that positive comes a huge amount of cyber-related risks. It has impacted the inherent cyber risk level of organizations. So what do I mean by that? I mean the inherent cyber risk, which is a specific term called out in lots of different regulations, including the FFIC and so on, and even the G7 cyber fundamentals. And what it relates to is your cyber risk level minus the impact of any cyber controls you may have in place. In other words, your raw cyber risk level. So it's made up of a number of different aspects. How many systems do you use? How much data? How many legacy systems? How many employees? What kind of business model you have? All of those data points, all of those aspects, all of those factors would factor into a metric which would allude to your level of inherent cyber risk. And in dealing with a risk level, of course, we often mitigate risk, and we mitigate it with different kinds of controls and different maturity levels of controls. And the balance between that impact of those controls on the risk, that balance is known as residual risk. So understanding your inherent cyber risk to start is so important. Now, when we look at COVID and that impact on inherent cyber risk, what we're really relating to the fact is that no business is operating exactly as it did pre-COVID. We have our employees working from home. We're using video conferencing more. So everybody's model has changed drastically in relation to COVID. And that is something that would change the inherent cyber risk metric of an organization. It's caused an increased reliance on the digital economy. Even as consumers, as businesses, our transactions have greatly increased in relation to what we're doing on the digital economy and the digital ecosystems that we now rely on an everyday basis. We have this again an increased reliance on the internet itself for everything, from entertainment to consumer activity, to human connectivity, to business. We are just so reliant now on the internet, even more so than we were pre-COVID. And there's been this absolutely massive increase in cyber threat activity. And we have had warnings from local law enforcement around the world, from Europol, from Interpol, and even the World Health Organization has put out warnings about the increased level of cyber threat activity. Now, we have to remember that cyber threat actors are opportunists, especially the criminals. They'll take advantage of a situation. They'll take advantage of people being discombobulated or any kind of opportunity they have to carry out whatever they want to from a nefarious perspective. And when we look at this, we see that, yes, there was lots of COVID-related scams, the kind of text messages people receiving or emails they're receiving saying, click here to see your COVID result, or somebody has been diagnosed with COVID and you need to click here to find out who your close contact was. But not just that. There was just this proliferation of the fact that we now get more home deliveries. So they will use spam and phishing emails pretending to be delivery companies. And they've just used as an overall opportunity to increase their activity, their scamming activity, and their criminal activity, targeting individuals, small businesses, large businesses, and global corporations. And what we're dealing with acceleration. Years have become months. Now, it mightn't feel like that, but the reality is when it comes to digitalization, when it comes to cyber threat activity, everything has just accelerated so much. I mean, if we look at this aspect of the new rules are that there are no rules, that's because of what we often refer to as shadow IT. Now, shadow IT is effectively when IT is operating outside of the normal controls and assurances within an organization. That's a phrase that's often used to describe shadow IT. It's operating without going through the normal policies and procedures, and they're doing things in almost a renegade way. And that could be cloud services, the network architecture, whatever it happens to be. So let me delve down on that a little bit and explain it a bit in more detail. So, you have a situation when COVID occurred first in lockdown one, if you like, where people were trying to keep their businesses operating and running. So they set up remote access into systems. People started working from home, and they may not have been in a position to follow all the policies and procedures that were put in place before COVID, because it may not have just been practical to be able to do those things. So maybe encryption wasn't used, or anti-malware wasn't installed in all systems, or home laptops were being used instead of corporate laptops. Those kind of things may have happened. And that's understandable, maybe even forgivable, given the circumstances where businesses, large and small, were trying to do their best to move forward. But now, as we are in the new normal and we transition to a new normal every day, we have to take account of that, and we have to look at that difference between our inherent cyber risk level before and since COVID and during COVID as we're going on, to make sure that we now have closed those gaps, because those short-term decisions we made have longer-term consequences and longer-term imperatives around regulations and responsibilities. So there's this also an increased pressure around the supply chain and the digital architecture. And wherever your organization plays a part in this, there will be an increased pressure up and downstream within the supply chain. And of course, there's this psychological impact on humans. We have the distracted workforce, discombobulated, working from home, maybe children, pets in a less than ideal condition, maybe working off a residential internet gateway in a shared environment. Maybe they share with as their living accommodation with other people, and all of these things cause a situation where it's easier for them to fall foul of a scam or click on a link and not have that normal day-to-day support or collegial feeling of support around them to be able to help and deal with those kind of issues. So they've been easy game in one way when it comes to cyber threat actors, because they only need to get lucky once. And that psychological impact on humans is not something that we can discount. It has been a huge part to be played in the success rate of bad guys attacking through that as a vector. Now, if we look under the hood and we look under from a deeper level to see what's under the scene on this, and we see that this work from home aspect means that there's an increased attack surface. So there's more points for the bad guy to hit it to be able to try and connect and get a route into the corporate network and into the corporate data and assets. The critical assets are exposed in many ways as a consequence. And this is not just for the financial sector that we're focusing on today, but also in relation to the critical assets of organizations and nation states indeed as well. And we have this distracted workforce, which is a huge element of that. And as I've mentioned, the critical national infrastructure of many countries and organizations themselves, their own critical infrastructure, is being attacked in a wholesale way. So we're getting it from every angle here, guys, and this is where we often lead to this combination of all of these things being put together as almost the perfect C-19 cyberstorm. And from a high level, a macro level, we can see what we're talking about here is the digital infrastructure, the cyber threat actors, privacy itself, geopolitics and economy. And when we're talking about privacy there is we're talking about the fact that we've often had to just forget about the concept of privacy many ways around COVID and just go, yeah, it's okay, there's a mobile phone number, or there's an email address, or there's whatever it happens to be, because we're just trying to get things done. And trying to put the genie back in the bottle it's very difficult sometimes when it comes to things like privacy. And when we see all of these things put together, it is like this Venn diagram, and in the middle we have this C-19 perfect cyberstorm where we are very vulnerable, very, very vulnerable. And, we often talk about new normal like it's down the road. And of course it is down the road, but today is a new normal. How we operate, how we deal, how we work today is different than it was. So this is our new normal today. And we have to accept that. And we have to accept that it will change tomorrow and after that as the impact of COVID is felt across businesses and society. It's going to drive change all the time in how we operate. But I'm reminded of the words of Christine Lagarde, who said that, called out pre-COVID, this was before the impact of COVID, that she felt and warned that a significant attack on the financial sector could cause a liquidity crisis. And there's lots more detail, obviously, in her speech. But I think, if they were her words pre-COVID, now we're in a much more vulnerable position where these cyber threat actors have had almost 2 years at this point to be working on compromising systems, surveilling how people operate, working out what the touch points are within networks, within anti-fraud systems, money laundering systems, and so on. And they've been sitting on networks watching all of that kind of activity, not necessarily just trying to do a smash and grab, steal some data and move on, but taking the time. And that's what we see in this long game with these more sophisticated, deep-pocketed OCGs, organized cyber criminal groups, and criminal groups are working, is they will take the long time to play the long game. And that's what we're very concerned about when it comes to the financial sector. So, I allude to the fact that there might be a positive in all of this, which is, COVID being the most effective digital transformation officer in the world. It has accelerated things, which is good and bad. I mean, it's accelerated things where projects are being run out faster. There's much more focus on getting things digitalized, apps being built, new customer services, reducing cost, increasing efficiency, all of those good things. But all of these things can only happen if supported by a good cyber risk management program. And doing nothing is the cyber risk contagion, because if you ignore this, then you're spreading cyber risk. And that's effectively what a key message I want to give you in this segment here, because it's very important that we all take responsibility. We are interconnected. We are interdependent. And if COVID has taught us nothing as human beings on this planet, is that we're interconnected and interdependent. And within your sector, it's very, very important to understand that what's good for you is good for your business partners, it's good for your clients, your customers, it's good for upstream, downstream, it's good for your organization and your sector as a whole. So what should we aim towards? Well, we should aim towards a culture of shared risk ownership across the sector. I mean, this isn't something where we can just rely on the big companies to deal with this. Everybody has a part to play. We want to aim towards a business enablement beyond compliance. Remember, that compliance is always the minimum standard. Compliance is a minimum baseline to make sure people are doing the very minimum of what needs to be required. But today, what people need is security. They need to make sure what they're doing is keeping them safe and secure from a cyber risk perspective. So that's way beyond compliance. So if you're only measuring compliance and you're only aiming towards compliance, it's frankly not good enough. You need to understand what your risk levels are and be able to aim towards closing that residual risk. Aim to be multidisciplinary. This is an area that is multidisciplinary, and it needs to combine legal, compliance, IT, procurement, all the various areas. This isn't something that's siloed down into just IT security. It's a business issue, and it should be seen as an investment, not a cost. All of the aspects of cyber risk management, cyber security, privacy management, which are all enshrined within part of this, are holistic across an organization, and they can be a competitive advantage and something that can empower an organization and its leaders to be able to deliver on their business objectives. And aim to balance your short-term goals with your longer-term imperatives. Do not forget about those longer-term imperatives and just keep making short-term decisions. You need to balance off those day-to-day risk-based decisions, and hopefully they're all intelligence-led, so that you can keep in mind and always keep an eye on those longer-term imperatives. And it's a good point, I suppose, that we can remind us all of the words of Charles Darwin. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the most responsive to change. And I think it's a key point that we all have to be able to adapt and change. And those that don't may perish throughout this, because we're going through a huge point of change. So now let's look at the cyber kill chain. That's understanding the anatomy of a cyber attack. Firstly, let's consider all the different kinds of threat vectors there are out there. For example, in the most recent NISA Cyber Landscape report, we see that there are a number of these threats listed. And the reality is that many of these are interrelated. So, for example, malware is related to a ransomware attack and so on. So we can look at these independently, but also we have to consider that there's a combined value there in relation to the risk element of these kinds of threat vectors. So in other words, when one particular vector of attack, ransomware, is being engaged on a particular organization, it is based on things like phishing email, it's based on things like malware being able to be put and orchestrated within that environment as well. And so it's important to understand these things are not just in isolation, but by being vulnerable to one means you're vulnerable to others in a combined threat approach. So let's look at the anatomy of a cyber kill chain. These are the standard steps generally taken as a standard approach from cyber threat actors, i.e. the bad guys, when attacking a particular organization. So it's not prescriptive, it's a general modus operandi of the bad guy, and you can learn from this at the different elements of where you can break that kill chain, the sort of things you consider what you can do to prevent that chain going in its full steps and the whole way through the entire chain process. So let's have a look at this. There are 10 steps to the cyber kill chain. Now, please understand, there are many different versions of the cyber kill chain out there. This is our own version from ICTTF, and it breaks down the 10 main steps that we've identified as being the characteristics of the general type of approach taken by threat actors, cyber threat actors, when attacking a particular organization. And step one is what we refer to as reconnaissance. So reconnaissance is when the bad guys will use open source intelligence in order to find out as much information as they can about the target that they are hoping to attack and hoping to compromise their particular network. And that's carried out on platforms such as Facebook, LinkedIn, Google searches, Bing searches, and so on. It's open source. It's open source intelligence. And it's amazing when you look at this, the amount of information that both individuals and organizations put out there about themselves. So, for example, who is the head of security? They may be putting out on social media that they are going on a vacation, going on holidays, and that they're not going to be within their office environment for a particular given period of time. All this kind of information is very valuable to the malefactor, those who are trying to do you some sort of nefarious intent at the end of the day. And it really depends on what their motivation is, what kind of information is useful to them. But we always find that there has been some sort of reconnaissance carried out in relation to the organization itself and the individuals. Now, this is often referred to as doxing, DOXING, sometimes spelled DOXXING. And doxing is essentially, if you like, it's the art form of putting together open source intelligence and finding out a pattern about somebody. So, for example, if somebody was targeting myself within the organization, they may dox me. And from that doxing activity, they would try and find out, well, who are the people who are direct reports to me within the organization? Who are my family and friends? What are the names of my pets? Realistically, this is the kind of information they want, because this is the kind of information that it possibly can be used as a psychological hook on potentially something like a phishing email or a spear phishing email that may be sent to a target such as me. And so they will try and find out as much relevant, specific, focused information on the target as they can. So stage 2 of the cyber kill chain is what we call weaponization. So weaponization is where they decide what kind of tools and services they may need in order to carry out their project. So let's say, for example, the intent of the bad guy here is that they want to attack an organization and they want to exfiltrate the data. That is, to remove the data from a secure location and make a copy of it to a remote site. So what they might choose is that they want to have maybe a phishing email sent to somebody to try and get them to click on it in order to put in a piece of malware into the environment. They may decide that they want to distract the security team by running a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack. That's the kind of attack where they flood the public-facing devices, such as a website of an organization, with traffic, and that would obviously cause an alarm, that would cause a reaction, and the focus of all of the security team and resources on dealing with that, while essentially the guys may come in the back door and do something nefarious within your environment. So weaponization, and I say the tools or the services because we have to remember that the people who are doing this, if we think back to the infographic about the key actors within the underground economy of cybercrime, often the organization leaders within that environment do not have the technical skills, and they may not even want to be bothered with using the tools themselves to do this activity, so they will just outsource it. They will find individuals and they will rent either their tools or their services to carry out a lot of the parts of the attack, and this is also known as CAAS, that is crime as a service. Step 3 is when they actually start the attack, if you like, from an operational point of view, is when they target the individual. So, for example, they may decide that they want to target myself, Paul Dwyer, in the ICTTF, and they will send a targeted email, for example, at myself and try and get me to click on a link, try and get me to open an attachment, visit a website. It really depends on what they've decided is the way that they wanted to deliver their payload, to deliver their malware into the environment. And as soon as they do that and they hit their target and the target clicks on something, they will then exploit whatever vulnerability they have identified. So they may have identified that there's certain open ports on a firewall, that there's certain public-facing parts of the infrastructure that are not patched, for example, and they will have worked out what is their end game here. What are they trying to do? Are they trying to securely, remotely control something within the environment, or are they trying to exfiltrate the data? It really depends on what their intentions are. But they'll exploit that vulnerability. They will then install the malware, which is stage 5. And when that malware is installed, because they've effectively got the individual, the target, to click on something, and they've exploited it from the point of view that the vulnerability was that this wasn't going to be detected, and it was able to bypass any sort of safeguards that were there in place, and it has run. Now, it will be usually a tiny payload of malware. And I hear many of you will probably say, but we have antivirus, we've anti-malware installed, there's no way the malware will run on our endpoints and on our devices. Well, actually, this is one of the illusions of cybersecurity, and it's one of the problems we have around the efficacy of endpoint protection using standard techniques such as old school anti-malware protection, because it's simply only works a small percentage of the time, because it is based on what are the most current threats, and I say it being the ubiquitous standard kind of anti-malware. There are different, more sophisticated tools that do a better job at identifying anomalous activity, but in general speaking, if somebody thinks, hey, I've got my anti-malware product, I'm totally safe, I'm okay, That is not the case. And it's a false sense of security to think that just because it's only one layer of protection, you need many layers of protection in order to be able to get past this. And the reality is, guys, that the reason they outsource the development or the use of crimeware and malware is because they're able to create unique variants of it that will simply bypass standard anti-malware tools, and it will not get detected. So we have to take for granted in many cases that they are, if they're even a semi-sophisticated threat actor, they're able to bypass if you're just relying on anti-malware. So they installed their piece of malware, a tiny piece of code. And what would that look like? Well, that might look like visiting a website and there's maybe a slight delay on getting to the website as it's downloaded and run a particular nefarious script, a malware script in other words. Or it may be that you've opened up a PDF attachment, maybe the screen flashes a little bit for a second and then the PDF opens up, and in that split second is when the malware is running in the background. And generally when this kind of malware runs, it deletes itself, so it doesn't leave any crumbs or evidence that it was there, and then it just stays in memory. And while it's in memory, it starts phoning home, so to speak, to what we call the C2 server. So we're at stage 6 now of the cyber kill chain, and calling to the command and control server. So a command and control server is essentially the command dashboard that the bad guy uses in order to be able to contact infected machines or compromised endpoints within your network environment. And from there's a handshake, there's a communication link between the infected device or endpoint in your environment and this command and control server that the bad guy is using. And that command and control server will be accessed by the bad guy through a number of what we call proxy servers that help hide and obfuscate who they are. It may even be installed on another compromised network. It may be on a legitimate network and it's being run there, but it's then pivoting out to attack other targets such as your own organizational network. So we now have a situation where the malware is installed, the victim has clicked on something, the malware itself has phoned home to the command and control server, and it's saying, well, what should I do now? And one of the first things it may do is it may install even more malware, more advanced capabilities, the ability maybe to turn on a video camera, to turn on a microphone, to encrypt, to be able to maybe degauss or shred the disks and data of the machine that it's on and destroy the hardware, even the BIOS of the hardware that is being used. That's the basic input-output system, effectively what we call bricking a device and making it actually unusable. And we've seen this in many kind of attacks as well, more sophisticated kinds of attacks. But basically, in most cases, we'll be moving on to link 7, and in link 7 of the cyber kill chain is when this bad guy is now, for all intents and purposes, sitting on your network. This is equivalent of the bad guy coming in, sitting down at a desk in your office, and now they can see everything on your network that individual's machine or endpoint that was compromised can see. Now think back to where I talked about cyber insiders. And we're at greatest risk from cyber insiders from the perspective of that we generally design all our architecture, all our abilities that we defend against the bad guy getting in, but we do a relatively poor job at defending from the inside out. And we trust that when somebody's inside on our network that they should be there, and therefore they have more access to resources, to network segments, to servers, to file shares, and those kind of things. And this is an advantage these guys play. And we call this Section 8 is when that they exploit that internal advantage. They're able to sniff around. They're able to effectively upgrade their rights within environments. They're able to escalate their privileges. They're able to sniff the traffic on the network. They're able to actually watch that traffic going up and down the network and be able to rebuild that traffic and see what other devices and other individuals in that network are sending, what kind of information. If it's not encrypted, they're able to do this really, really easily. So they're going to exploit that internal advantage. And then step 9 is when they'll carry out their nefarious actions. So for example, as I talked about, maybe by way of this example, maybe that they want to exfiltrate data. That is to say that they want to steal and copy that information and send it up to another remote location. And the reality is, in many cases, what they'll do is, because they put a lot of effort into this, they have essentially good contingency plans, good resilience plans, and good essentially business continuity plans. What they'll do is they will often exfiltrate to 2 or 3 different sites in case a link breaks, in case something becomes corrupt, in case one is detected. They'll have 2 other routes to get that information out, and they'll often disguise that traffic as a legitimate kind of traffic. So, for example, and without getting too technical, there are lots of different languages, if you like, being spoken on your network, different types of protocol, different types of language that's been spoken up and down your network all day long. And a lot of this kind of languages is not being measured or filtered because it's generally seen as legitimate kinds of traffic. So, for example, I would say DNS kind of traffic, domain name service traffic used for resolving websites to IP addresses. And that's the kind of traffic we see all day long going up and down the network. And what these guys will do, they'll often, when they're exfiltrating the data, they will disguise that traffic. They won't show it directly as like a file transfer protocol being used to do that. They may disguise it as another kind of protocol so that they can bypass any of the safeguards that may be in place. Now, their actions may be other kind of actions. The actions may be that they have compromised your network, targeted the individual maybe at a bank holiday, let's say, for example, St. Patrick's Day. Then they may take, in March, then they may take a couple of months where going from, say, for example, step 3 all the way up to step 8 might be an 8-week period. And we've seen this, for example, as the profile around the HSE ransomware attack, where they went from step 3 to step 8, which was really taking about an 8-week period. And because it was a ransomware attack, they wanted to take their time. They wanted to understand what safeguards in place, the lay of the land, so to speak. And then they'll carry out their action. So in the case of something like a ransomware attack, it would be something like encrypting the data, and obviously they may have exfiltrated some of the data as well. So where I reference there the HSE attack, what I'm talking about is when in May of 2021, when the Irish Health Service, the entire health service, became a victim of a large-scale ransomware attack. And for those of you who want to know more about that, obviously you could Google that information or go to your favorite search engine and find out more about that case, because there are lots of valuable lessons to be learned from these kinds of incidents as well that we can all take. Now, finally, guys, there's step 10. And this one takes a little bit of explaining. So if we look at the 10th link in the cyber kill chain, this is where the bad guys protect you. This is where the bad guys actually set up security on your network to make sure that nobody compromises your network and that nobody is attacking you. And now there's 2 parts of this. The first part is they want to make sure there's nobody else in on your environment. And if there is, they clean up and they kick them off your environment. And when I say clean up, if they identify existing malware, they may remove it. They may clean your network to get rid of any bad guys that are there. And they're doing this not because they're altruistic, but because they're basically, they put in time, resource, energy, everything else into compromising your network. And they don't want anybody else to be there or to gain an advantage on this. So they will set up these alarms and triggers to make sure that no other bad guy can come into your network environment while they own you, while they are essentially operating within your environment. But there is another really sinister reason for this as well. And that sinister reason is that they don't want to be detected, and they want to know if they are detected. So if, for example, it's often a knee-jerk reaction for network administrators or security professionals that if they see a compromised identity on a network, just to cut that identity off. But that might trigger the bad guy's alarm system to say, we've been identified, the show is up, the game is up, we need to come off this network and we need to go somewhere else. But they don't do that. What they do is they will throw what we often refer to as a digital grenade over the shoulder. They will try and cause discombobulation, they will try and cause destruction, and that may come in many forms. One of those forms may be that if they've compromised all your usernames and passwords by taking advantage there where we are in, for example, link 8, where they exploit their internal advantage, maybe that they were able to download all the usernames and passwords while they're inside your network. And they may dump that on a website such as Pastebin. And Pastebin is one of these public websites up on the surface internet, readily available to anybody, but used by all these kind of groups where they will dump this kind of information because they want to cause mayhem as they exit and run for the hills, so to speak. Other kind of techniques that they would use is they may drop a ton of child abuse imagery within your network, which means, of course, that you have to contact law enforcement, you have to handle that incident, and that, of course, causes a whole other set of protocol of behaviors that need to be put in place. And generally, what they'll do is they will try and cause you as much damage and much destruction, as much discombobulation as they can as they run for the hills, because they know there's a limited amount of resources to deal with this kind of thing, and they want to disappear while you're trying to put the fires out, so to speak. So that, guys, is a cyber kill chain. These are the 10 kind of standard steps, standard links into how most attacks are carried out. And there's slight variances in how they operate through, but this is a great understanding and a fantastic way to get an overview into how bad guys compromise environments and organizations within all particular sectors, not just, for example, the financial sector, aviation, retail, but all particular sectors. So now let's look at the segment on developing a cyber strategy. So every cyber strategy should be based on the unique cyber DNA of an organization. So what do I mean by that? Well, every organization is different. No two organizations are the same. Their business model may be different. Their background, their culture, their use of information communication and technology may be different. There's all of these subtle variances within organizations that mean essentially the cyber DNA use of technology, their requirements overhead in relation to the drivers around regulatory, business, and legal compliance are all slightly different. Where they operate from a geographic point of view around the world will also be one of those things that influences the cyber DNA of an organization, because it's not just the technical piece, but it's how the technology is used and it's where it's used. And in what particular sector, the size and scale of the organization. All of these things factor into that uniqueness of the organization. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. So let's look at the top of this infographic, and we accept that every business has a business model. And if you're a bank, or whether you're working in any aspect of the financial sector, for example, there will be different scale, different size, different kinds of services that are being offered. And so there will be these unique traits and characteristics of the organization. And every organization will have different business ICT requirements. ICT is the acronym for Information, Communication, and Technology. So here we're talking about the cloud. We're talking about devices, endpoints, laptops, mobile phones, servers, artificial intelligence, machine learning, apps, you name it. All of these things fall within that bucket, if you like, of business ICT requirements. In other words, how does the business leverage ICT? How does it use it to interact with its customers, with its suppliers, its business partners, and internally? That's the business ICT requirements. That is how the business is going to use ICT. And depending on how and where it's using those business ICT requirements will dictate which business, legal, and regulatory requirements are fall within this area that we often refer to just as a holistic term of requirement drivers. And that will dictate which business requirement drivers are there, which legal ones, and which regulatory ones. So, for example, if you're operating based on size and scale in certain jurisdictions, certain controls will apply. And vice versa, depending on your size and scale and where you're operating, you may not be able to put certain kinds of controls in place because they may be illegal in certain territories, certain legal jurisdictions. So it's very, very important that when it comes to business, legal, and regulatory guidance, controls, and supervisory issuances, that every organization understands that they're operating within those. In other words, they're operating legally and they're operating in line with regulatory compliance and guidance. And that's a really key aspect. So if you think of it from the aspect and perspective of cyber laws, those laws are there to protect us and to be used if somebody is attacking or compromising our digital assets. But at the same time, we also need to make sure as businesses that we are complying with those laws and with those regulations and with that guidance as well, and that we're not breaching any of those things. And this becomes even, there's obviously a deeper understanding there now from the point of view of regulators around the world when we see, for example, 8-figure fines being given to financial sector organizations in relation to, for example, the level of cyber resilience that they have in place, that it's simply deemed as that they either couldn't prove the level they had in place or was deemed not to be fit for purpose and not to be good enough. So this is a huge driver and a huge area of a complex growth in relation to cybersecurity, and it shouldn't be overlooked. It should be given the proper resources and focus that it needs, because, as I say, it's imperative that every organization is operating legally and within the parameters of guidance and supervisory issuances from the sector itself. So let's look at this from the perspective of the challenge of trying to develop a cyber strategy within an organization. And on one side, we have the cyber threat actors, we have cyber criminals, we have nation states, hacktivists, terrorists, thrill seekers, and insiders. And on the other side, we have the complexity and challenge of dealing with our employees, our suppliers, our business partners, of course, our customers, everything else. And this is part of the challenge in dealing with all of these aspects, because the board is responsible in relation to being able to monitor, evaluate, and direct that cyber strategy. And that is the challenge in putting a cyber strategy together, that it will be an effective strategy. And it's something that the board is able to use to monitor, evaluate, and direct the cyber risk element of how the business is being operated. And I've mentioned the requirement drivers overhead here, and I've put in this extra slide, if you like, because I think it bears and it warrants reinforcing this point, because depending on where you're operating around the world, if you're just in a domestic location, you'll have a certain amount of overhead in this space, but if you're operating internationally, you may see complex conflicts in some cases in relation to regulations and how policies and requirements are being implemented by various authorities around the world. So this is something where you need specific expertise, either in-house or outsourced, in relation to being able to deal with this dynamic landscape. Because if I give you a quick example, and people often think that this, when it comes to, say, for example, privacy requirements, that, oh, well, there's just GDPR, and they think that's all there is. But there's actually well over 300 different privacy standards around the world that may be leveraged or used, or you may be fall under, depending on your business model and depending on your size, depending on your complexity and where you're operating around the world. So this is something that certainly warrants a lot of focus and attention. And if I can share something with you in my experience, is that often this is a 9 out of 10 times a failing point when dealing with organizations within your sector, when I will ask them to list which regulations, which laws that they fall under from this perspective, and they struggle to be able to understand which ones are relative to them and why, that they are, and what they are doing in relation to being able to, and finally being able to prove that they are complying with those regulations. So there's a whole burden there for the organization, and a whole challenge for the organization to make sure that they have their act together, so to speak. And of course, a lot within the sector have very advanced and mature compliance units, and it's about being able to empower them with the right kinds of education and the right kinds of communication between the other parts of the organization that are dealing with certain aspects of this, such as obviously the IT department, maybe the cybersecurity office, those kind of areas of the business too. So here is another aspect of it where we show it as a Venn diagram, and the reality is in that Venn diagram that your organization is somewhere in the middle. So you've got regulatory pieces like mentioned GDPR. You may have, for example, if this was if I was speaking to an Irish organization, I may be talking about the Legal Criminal Justice Act of 2017. I might be talking about business requirements around ISO 27001. But there are over 400 different cybersecurity laws and regulations in general around the world, and that's at a growing number all the time. And those pieces of legislation, those artifacts, those instruments from over 175 legal jurisdictions are comprised of well over 10,000 individual controls. And what we often talk about when dealing with organization is for them to understand what we refer to as touch points, or a nexus of controls. And that nexus of controls is the reality that there is semantics between many of these instruments. And by that I mean that they're asking the same thing in a different way. And for an organization to understand and be able to cross-map their requirements and be able to understand that they're able to operate in a holistic way in dealing with this. That is a big win for an organization. That increases efficiency, return on investment, and it generally increases your compliance level and your security level and reduces your risk level, because you're acting as a joined up organization dealing with these things and not operating in silos. So to illustrate an example of that would be, instead of running GDPR in one silo, PCI compliance in another silo, cyber resilience in a third silo, and maybe network architecture on a fourth silo, and it goes on and on and on, that all of these things are joined up from the perspective of understanding where the relationships are between these things. And you can see this translation going on between things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, and a lot of other kinds of standards. So you can reduce your burden. You can reduce the effort involved by taking that step of joining up and understanding your environment better and understanding your compliance overhead in a more strategic way. This really is a key to success in this area. Now, I like to use analogies, and I like to use the analogy of a car when we talk about cyber strategy, because if we think of the cyber strategy and why it's so important to an organization, it's because every business will have a business strategy. And we've talked about digital transformation. We've talked about the changes that are happening within businesses almost on a dynamic day-to-day basis. So every business has its unique business strategy. It wants to deliver on that strategy. It wants to have its outcomes deliver on its goals and so on. Now, to do that, and for the two wheels of the car to be completely aligned, it should have a cyber strategy which is aligned completely with that business strategy. So it's not a off-the-shelf, download a cyber strategy of best practice off the internet and think that's going to work in your organization. Your organization is unique. Therefore, your cyber strategy should be unique and tailored for your organization, for your culture, for your business objectives, for your business strategy. And having these two things aligned means that the car, the vehicle, the business can move forward at pace. And we could think of the steering wheel as cyber governance and oversight, because if we want to make sure that it's going in the right direction, of course, we need a steering wheel. And to keep everything together, we can think of that as a cyber risk framework made up of the policies, the procedures, all the evidence and all the controls that are put in place to run and operate your cybersecurity program across your business value chain, and of course across your supply chain upstream and downstream, and make sure that you're protecting not just you but the sector that you operate within. Now on this infographic, we can look at the importance of communication. We can look at this in a bit more detail. So if I walk you through from left to right on this infographic, we'll start off here where every business has a vision. And maybe that the organization wants to be the best retail bank in the world, or have the best banking app, or whatever it happens to be. They have a vision, and that vision will be translated into a mission, an articulated mission that gets written down and ingrained within the business strategy, perhaps communicated not just to the internal stakeholders, but all the key stakeholders, including investors and so on, that what is the mission of this organization. And of course, they'll define goals, and each of those goals will have key objectives. And generally, the key objectives within a business strategy are value preservation or value creation. This is what the business is going to say that it wants to do in a given period of time. And to understand what success looks like in relation to those key objectives, they will define what that outcome would look like. So if they want to win a certain part of the market by bringing out a certain piece of technology, they will define that as the outcome, so that everybody understands if they've met their key objective, that they will have realized and got to the stage that's outlined in stage 5, which is an outcome. Now, to do that, to deliver that for an organization, they will have tactics. So we're at stage 6 here, and those tactics will be broken down into key pieces, and those key pieces will have key actions related to them. And all of those key mini projects, all of those programs of work, all of those activities, those initiatives, those innovations, all of those things will be based on being comprised part of a cyber risk framework. Because if you're going to deliver transformation, if you're going to deliver technology and operate technology, it needs to be wrapped wrapped in a cyber risk framework. You need to make sure that you're operating legally, you're protecting the assets, you're protecting your infrastructure, you're protecting the organization itself, and you have a responsibility to do that. Because when we talk about oversight and governance, and we talk about the board's responsibility, one of the questions I'm often hit with is often, well, who's responsible for cybersecurity and who's responsible for cyber risk? The CEO is responsible and the board are accountable. Full stop, period. That's it. End of story. Because this is a business issue and this is something that has to be treated as such. And I encourage organizations to see cyber risk and cybersecurity as an investment, not a cost, especially as we operate in a digital society, how important it is to invest into the cyber trust and the brand that goes along with that, and how to deal with incidents and so on as they may occur. So a cyber risk framework is key, and every cyber risk framework is made up of controls, and those controls are based around people, they're based around processes, they're based around technology, and so on. Now, if we remember that I talked about this key term of inherent cyber risk. So inherent cyber risk is the risk you have minus the impact of any controls. So in other words, the raw risk your organization has with a piece of technology or an aspect of a particular program of work you're operating. It doesn't take into account any of the mitigation controls you have in place. That's your inherent cyber risk level. Now, when you put controls in place, obviously many of those are mitigation kind of controls, but the balance of the risk that remains is known as residual risk. Now, if you're able to identify that residual risk, that balance of risk after applying those controls, that is exactly what the board needs to understand, because they need to hear and understand what that risk level is in relation to their goals, their key objectives, their outcomes, and be able to relate it back to the actual individual cyber risk controls, identify that residual risk, and report it back to the board. In other words, if I give you a quick, mundane, pedestrian, high-level macro example here, let's say, for example, there was a project to run out a new app, a banking app, and that was one of the goals of the organization. They had defined the key objectives, they had defined all of the outcomes. Well, from a cyber risk perspective, what you need to be able to do is identify the controls that running out that banking app depend on, identify the level of maturity of those controls in place so that you can identify the residual risk and report that residual risk back to the board. Because now we're talking about something that's meaningful to the board, meaningful to business leadership, because they can go, so what you're saying is these things you've identified within an environment as risks could impact on our goals, our key objectives, and our outcomes. You will get their attention, you will get their buy-in, because this is something that they can relate to, as opposed to going in with a pen test report, a penetration testing report maybe, full of lots of technical jargon, and saying, hey, we've identified all these vulnerabilities and we need to patch them and we need this, because that is very difficult for a board or business leaders to understand that level of technical detail, but they will understand if it's being communicated in a way that they can relate back to the business. So this is an imperative. This is something that's really strategically important, that every organization can relate their cyber risk and the residual cyber risk that they're carrying back to their business strategy. So I touched upon metrics there and residual risk in relation to the cyber strategy. And now in this segment, I'd like to talk about what we call C/Q, cyber risk quantification, meaningful metrics, and how to empower leadership. So one of the challenges that leadership has is in understanding the risk landscape when it comes to cyber threats, not just from an external global perspective, but in how it relates to them and their organization and the business objectives of that organization. And of course, traditionally, business leaders are obviously very busy people, and they like to see things simplified down as much as possible to make them easier to understand, and they often rely on TLPs or traffic light protocol in relation to reports, because they're easy to understand. What's red, what's amber, what's green, where is the risk going to be? And sometimes this can work in relation to reporting on cyber, but sometimes it is not the most effective way to relate back on a cyber perspective, especially in relation to, if I maybe refer to them as bog standard tools and template reports that are out there, because again, they will not be contextual. They will not be relating things necessarily back to your organization, your business mission. So understanding and creating what we call meaningful metrics, the ways that the business can understand and everybody can have a common way of measuring things within the organization, is far more effective. And a gap analysis is obviously something that every business is very familiar with. In other words, understanding we are here and we're trying to get to there, going from X to Y and what that might look like. And these are all great ways and great approaches to dealing with this, because what we have to understand is security is a journey. It's not a destination. You don't just deliver cybersecurity and you're done. It's a dynamic cyber threat landscape. Your business model is evolving all the time. Therefore, your approach and how you deal with it needs to change and be just as dynamic and deal with those changes as they occur. So what we're talking about here is effective risk management. And thankfully, within your sector, this is something that has been done traditionally very well, and dealing with risk and managing risk in a very mature part of most organizations. So what you want to be able to do here is augment those abilities by able to get those parts of the business be able to support the cyber threat element of this in a much more effective way. And this is where I talk about being able to move the responsibility of cyber security away from it being seen as just an IT issue and it being seen as the business issue and something that is managed as another element of risk within the organization. So I mentioned briefly already about the cybersecurity illusion, and this is something really, really important to understand, is that you need to be able to take responsibility and understand and scratch the surface of any metrics that somebody presents to you in your organization, because it's too easy to trust and, if you like, take comfort out of really poor metrics, or really irrelevant metrics. And the reality is, when it comes to the technical side of cybersecurity, there is no shortage of metrics and white noise and technical acronyms and all of these kind of fancy charts explaining how technically vulnerable an environment is and everything else like that. But what there is a shortfall is in understanding what the risk to the business is, the business model, and how all of that relates to. So it's very important that you take certain metrics with a pinch of salt when they're coming from a technical aspect, but actually understand what they mean relative to your organization. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You need to be able to understand how this affects your inherent risk level and how this affects your cyber strategy. That's a really important part. And, if I illustrate this by way of an example, recent studies around anti-malware would show that it would only catch maybe less than 5% of malware, whereas most people think by having anti-malware implemented, installed, up to date and running, that they're stopping all malware. But the reality is that 95% of malware can still get through most malware endpoint protection systems. So there is this cybersecurity illusion. We have seen time and time again where there has been pieces of malware that have been not even identified for up to 5 years at a time that have operated within environments. So don't just think because you're spending money or because you've just invested 7 figures into some sort of a magic bullet cybersecurity AI intelligence-led system or solution that you think that you are secure, because it's not true. This is an ongoing process and it's about risk management. And my final point on this is, do not confuse compliance with security. You may be compliant, but that doesn't make you secure. So you may be passing compliance audits and compliance assessments, but that doesn't make your organization secure. It just means that it's compliant and it's able to prove that it's operating the most baseline rudimentary controls that a regulator is looking for. Because the job of a regulator is not to implement or provide the high level consultative type of approach in relation to security. They're trying to gain assurance and confidence that you're operating the most basic kind level of controls. And all compliance legislation is always behind the risk curve, let's be honest, because it takes time to document it, it takes time to implement it, publish it, and so on. So it's always going to be behind where the risk levels are. So this is about risk. And if we think of the simple formula for risk, is likelihood by impact. So what is the likelihood of something happening, and what's the impact to your organization? And cross-referencing those, you can see here in a very simplistic kind of risk matrix, if something had a medium likelihood and a medium impact, we might define it as critical. Of course, your organization is going to run something much more sophisticated than this, but this is what you want to be able to understand. And this is how you evaluate particular kinds of controls. So for example, if getting back to the example we talked about around the cyber strategy, and we talked about potentially in organizations running out something like a banking app that might look at a particular threat vector and say, well, what's the likelihood of that happening to our organization? And if it did, what's the impact? And you might have a scale on likelihood of 1 to 5. You might have a scale on impact of 1 to 5. And therefore, if it was a medium 3 and a medium impact level 3, 3 threes are 9, it would be a level 9 risk. It's that kind of simplistic formula that can become quite sophisticated and quite relevant to create something that everybody can believe in and everybody can get behind within your own organization. And guys, risk management is about balance. I've already mentioned some key phrases like one size does not fit all. It has to be contextual. It has to be based on your inherent risk level. And the reality is that you're balancing controls such as technical processes and so on against the risk elements of things like using legacy systems, the supply chain, digital transformation projects, and so on and so forth, and of course the cyber risk landscape. So this is just a simplistic view of us understanding that this is always going to be a balancing act and balancing the availability of resources, budgets, and so on to deal with these kind of things. But being able to prioritize risk and understand risk is very, very important. And when you're talking cyber with the board, or when we're engaging with business leaders within an organization, it is so important that the business leaders, from their perspective, understand or empowered to understand what some of these elements mean, so that they can have the confidence to be able to push back at technical reports and understand, is something just a technical analysis, or is this related back to the business and being contextual in that way? That's absolutely key. And for those who are not on that side of the fence, so to speak, from the leadership piece, maybe coming from a technical perspective, it's incumbent upon you to be able to translate and communicate in a way that the board understands. So always make it meaningful, always relate it back to the business. There's no point talking about jargon and talking about level 5 CVE vulnerabilities in relation to, Microsoft SQL and all of these kind of SQL injections and these kind of things. You will just lose the audience. You will lose their buy-in. They need to understand what it means to your organization. Translate, communicate, empower the board to be able to understand it, so they can make intelligence-led decisions in relation to the risks that once they understand them, they can make intelligence-led decisions in relation to managing those risks and treating those risks. So when we look at policy, when we look at what can be done, we're really talking about, setting the culture within an organization and defining, well, what's the right or the wrong thing to do. And this, again, is incumbent upon leadership when they're setting policy within their organization to understand what are the ethics, what is the morality to the various kind of controls that are being put in place. So it's all about beliefs and behaviors. So at this stage, I've talked somewhat about, external laws and regulations, regulatory-based stuff, and so on. And their elements are obviously very important. But internally, that translates into policies, and policies are how we do things within an organization, and what should be done. And then we have, the how it's going to be done through the procedures, and then we have, if you like, a level 3 perspective in relation to documentation, in relation to things like work lists, instructions, and checklists, and then we have the evidence at level 4 of how things are carried out. So there are essentially 4 different levels of documentation that are required, but policy and setting policy from the very top level and level 1, 2, and so on is so important for an organization to understand how do we handle things in an organization, what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do. Now, given the window of opportunity we have here in this particular briefing, I can only touch upon some of these subjects, but I will say this, that it's very important when setting policy to understand that many organizations now use artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automated bots and so on to carry a lot of activities. So you need to think about that from the perspective of, are these bots, or is this artificial intelligence that you're implementing to take care of customers? What are the ethics involved? How is data being handled? How are customers being treated? In the same way, if they were human employees, so to speak, doing that, how do you change policy? How do you educate them? And how do you make sure that the culture is within the policy, and that policy is implemented within the artificial intelligence and the technology that's being used within your organization? So people are a major attack vector because, we often say that the bad guy will try and attack the human and hack the human when they can't break through the systems. But the reality is that they try all sides, and sometimes it is that blended approach that becomes successful for them. And what we need to be able to instill in our people, in our organizations, is loyalty. We need to go way beyond compliance training. They shouldn't simply be about, well, don't click on links. That's very important messaging. But what we need people to is understand that they need to take a responsibility, they need to care, and that they are part of the solution in defending the organization. Really, really important that they understand that they 24/7 are a target for malfactors, for cyber threat actors, 24/7. So when they are operating on dating sites, if they're operating on social networking sites, or any other kind of environment, even online gaming, we have seen them being targeted by cyber threat actors, that they are essentially a target because they operate within the financial sector itself. So it's really important to understand that. And what I'm really talking about here is the fact that this is everyone's responsibility, not somebody else's responsibility. So when you see this image of an unattended bag in an airport, the first good instinct people have is, that doesn't look right. I need to do something about that. Now, what they don't do is go, oh, that's somebody else's responsibility, I'll ignore that, because they understand there may be an impact on them. And so if you have 500 employees, 1,000 employees, that's 1,000 people that can protect your organization, or it's 1,000 weak points in your organization because they don't care enough to do something about it when they see. So there are huge lessons we could take from the aviation industry, for example, where the aviation industry safety is everybody's responsibility, not just one particular person or one particular department. So when it comes to cybersecurity, one of the keys to success on an effective cybersecurity culture and a cyber risk culture is implementing that loyalty within your staff and those that operate within your environment, including business partners, that everybody knows and understands they have a key part and responsibility to play in protecting the organization. So setting policy is so, so important. And as I mentioned, ethics, the integrity and principles that are going to get enshrined within those policies is so important. And again, I want to underline this point. Security is beyond compliance. There are lots of organizations that have passed every compliance audit they're given, but they are compromised and they're attacked and they become significant victims of cyber threat actors because they were not secure. They relied on compliance being their level of security instead of understanding where their inherent risk was and making sure the maturity and level of controls was up to that risk level. They simply set their security level as their compliance level. That is not good enough. I'll say that one more time. Having your security level as your compliance level is not good enough. You need to understand what your inherent cyber risk level is so that you can have the appropriate security level put in place. Now, cyber risk, bottom line, one of my key phrases in this, guys, is if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So we're talking here about cyber risk quantification, we're talking about meaningful metrics, and we're talking about understanding what that is. So look, metrics is basically the science of measuring. And you may use traffic light reports and measure things in 3 colors. You may measure things on a percentage basis or a percentile basis, whatever it tends to be. It really depends on the complexity and sophistication of how you want to do this. But everybody should really be lined up onto the same page and understand what is good, what is bad, and what the aspirations are for the organization. Now, one of the key places to start is understanding, well, where are you? Where is your risk level at the moment? Now, given the fact, and we've talked about this already in our segment on COVID, and the impact on cyber risk, given the fact that everybody's inherent cyber risk level has changed over the last couple of years, everybody's business models are transforming, therefore we can take it that the inherent risk level has changed. So, but can we take it that the existing controls are the appropriate controls for that risk level? Are they at the appropriate maturity level, given the new shape and nuances to our cyber risk level? So the World Economic Forum suggests the best thing to do is to start off with a cyber risk assessment. In other words, understand where you are and where you should be. And that's a really, really key point and a great piece of advice from the World Economic Forum. Because what it means is holistically, an organization can understand where their focus should be, where they're going to get the best bang for buck in relation to investing into the cyber risk program. So let's look here at the characteristics of a really good cyber assessment. I'm going to go through 10 points so that if you're considering having a cyber risk assessment, that you can consider that these should be aspects of the kind of assessment that you're getting done. Because what I want to go back to is the first couple of slides we talked about in this segment, which is traffic light reports and gap analysis. And the reason I included those within this segment is because we need to understand that often that's simply not good enough. Somebody coming in with a checklist and saying, well, I looked at 100 different controls in your organization. I asked you whether you had them or didn't have them. I got 50 yeses and 50 no's. You're at 50%. What does that mean? It means nothing to the organization because it's not telling you which controls are at the relevant maturity level, which ones are carrying residual risk. So this has to be risk-based. It's a cyber risk assessment, not a gap analysis that the World Economic Forum is suggesting that organizations should have. So it should be holistic. And by holistic, I mean that it should be across your entire business value chain, but it may be piece by piece across your business value chain. So, for example, you might go location by location. You might decide that your business value chain is made up of different departments, different business lines, but holistically, you want to end up measuring your entire organization, not just, for example, your IT security department. You need to understand how procurement are operating, how legal, how human resources, how all the different elements that are so important and intrinsic to the success of your organization are operating. And they should deliver meaningful metrics to your organization. Again, meaningful metrics to me, if I was to describe what that means, they should be simply understood by the business. They should be relative and contextual to the business, and they should be understood from the point of view that they understood how the numbers are created, how the metric is formed. It shouldn't be something so sophisticated and complex based on some fancy algorithm that nobody really understands. Well, what is the impact of change, or what is the impact of investment of this particular control, or how the risk number is made up. So often when looking at this within an organization, the challenge is to simplify a lot of the metrics that they're currently using so that we get to a point that they are basic metrics that people can actually understand, and that they understand what's behind them and what impacts those numbers. You should take into account privacy. Privacy is an aspect of a good cyber risk and cybersecurity program. It's an imperative when it comes to operating legally, obviously, around the world, and in different regions there are different privacy concerns and different privacy burdens in relation to what has to be done and the impact of not getting it right, i.e. fines, naming and shaming, qualitative risk, quantitative risk, pecuniary damages from civil actions, all those kind of things. So really important that whatever kind of assessment, cyber risk assessment you're taking place, also considers what kind of privacy controls you have in place. Now, again, why this is important, guys, and I don't mean to labor this point, but the reason I'm going to emphasize it is because it's really important that you stop operating in silos if you are operating in silos. You have to see this as a joined up, holistic cyber assessment that takes into account all the pieces related to cyber risk management within your organization, and privacy is an aspect of that. And it should converge both worlds. So again, to illustrate this point, what I mean by converging both worlds, evaluating the cyber risk of an organization should take into account what physical controls are in place. Again, they shouldn't operate in silos. You should be able to combine and understand what your strengths are. If there's a bad actor that means to do you harm, they won't just rely on hacking in through a firewall. They may also decide that they want to physically gain access to your premises. And of course, you'll have physical controls in place, CCTV, you may have identity systems, systems, biometrics, you may have keypads on doors, all those kind of things that are so important. But they also form part of your overall cyber risk program, because what you want is to stop physical access to digital assets as well, and be able to understand where your strengths and weaknesses are holistically across the organization. So making sure these things are connected, interconnected, is so important, especially when measuring the risk back to the organization. They can't operate divorced of each other. And be collaborative. Again, you can see where I'm going with this. This is about collaboration within the organization and externally within the supply chain. Being able to understand that this isn't siloed into an IT security department. This is something that is a business issue. It should be led by a business leader, somebody who can report and influence the board, and somebody that has the gravitas to be able to do that and be able to holistically bring people together to deal with this. So whether that's an individual or a function or within an organization, it's important that it's a collaborative approach. And it should be able to identify priorities such as resilience. So again, cyber resilience is the ability to be able to recover and be able to continue in business during and after an attack. And it's very important I've said during, because a lot of organizations still need to be able to operate while they're being attacked and while you're dealing with an attack. Dealing with an attack can take sometimes months. So you're not going to close up business and stop operating until you deal with the attack. So it's about being able to have an ability of cyber resilience. So the fact is, you will be targeted for an attack. The fact is, more than likely, you will at some stage become the victim of a cyber attack. And the fact is, you should have a mature level of cyber resilience, perhaps based on the minimum expectations of the European Central Bank in relation to governance and oversight and cyber resilience. And they're the kind of metrics and they're the kind of things you want to be able to understand, so that you can understand whether what you're doing is what good looks like. And you need to understand your business value chain. Again, many organizations will perhaps look at cyber risk and cybersecurity from the perspective of IT, and that they won't look at it from the perspective of the overall business and the business strategy. This is a failing. This is a mistake. You need to look at this holistically from the business strategy and the business model perspective if you're going to understand how to deal with it. And of course, different levels of cybersecurity would be applied at different parts of the business. You wouldn't expect the same cybersecurity controls to be in the marketing department as they are around maybe controlling the payroll. And therefore, identifying all those different aspects and those different parts of the business helps you design, implement and manage an appropriate cyber security and risk program and privacy program for your organization, based on what are the different kinds of assets, what are the different kinds of elements of the business, and what is the appropriate level of security in those particular parts of the business. And it should be an efficient rinse and repeat model. And I've added this point because it's a personal bugbear of mine that so many assessments take part and take place based on subjective input of consultants, or the subjective background, culture, or experience of a particular auditor. In other words, somebody will come in from a consultancy firm and say, well, I think you should have this, or I think you should have that. But where is the empirical evidence that this is what they need, the organization needs, in relation to inherent risk level? So the methodology that you use to create your assessment should be something you can rinse and repeat, because when you find your levels of risk and you find and develop your roadmap, you also then want to be able to measure on an ongoing basis, are you improving, how are things done? And as your own business model will be changing and transform, again, you want to be able to rerun your assessment process time and time again, and making sure that it's not subjective, that it's a more of a scientific methodological approach to dealing with measuring this. So a rinse and repeat model is very important. And it should produce risk-based indicators. So here we're talking about key risk indicators. So remember, they're essentially KPIs, key performance indicators, which look at the past, how well you've been doing. And it's great to be able to get KPIs in how a cyber risk program is operating and a cyber security program is operating in an organization. But what's more important for leadership and to empower business leaders is they want to understand those KRIs. And those KRIs, for example, based on some of the examples we've been using here, could be based on the risks risks around delivering a particular business objective based on the residual risk being identified within controls. That's the kind of intel, that's the kind of intelligence that the board needs to understand, so that they're getting these risk indicators and saying, hey, we're running out a new business innovation, a new banking app. We've identified that we've got residual risk around these various controls, perhaps around instant response, and here's what that looks like, and our risk indicators lighting up, and we're informing and we're empowering the business leaders so that they can make informed decisions. And again, finally, to translate those touch points, so to remind you of what the touch points are, it's the very fact that so many of these regulations, standards, supervisory issuances, framework standards, so on all around the world, there's semantics within them. They're asking the same thing in a different way. And a key to success, a key to increasing your return on investment, your efficacy and efficiency around all of this area is about translating those touch points, being able to map them. So when something's been asked for under GDPR, how does that relate back to something that's been asked for maybe under FFIC or the New York DFS or some sort of local regulation that's being asked for? Where is the commonality? Where is the nexus? Where is the translated touch point between these things? They're asking it in a slightly different way, but it's the same principle as being asked. So how do we begin? Well, we begin by getting help and by collaborating. And that's by about understanding which colleagues can help us in dealing with this and gaining that advice and expertise and help from colleagues and identifying those strengths and weaknesses within the organization so the strong can help the weak in certain areas. And that can also go into the supply chain and into business partners and so on, and be able to identify who can help with this. It shouldn't be the tail trying to wag the dog, guys. It should be the entire organization getting behind this and having that collaborative forum, that collaborative ability that's managing it from a leadership perspective holistically across the organization. Understanding what kind of controls are appropriate for that car as it's going forward, given the business circumstances, given the risk elements of what's going on, what are the particular controls, and having consensus and having input from a more collaborative field within the organization is much better than it just being seen from one siloed view within a pane. So it's a really important to get collaboration operating within your organization around cyber risk. And remember, again, if there's one thing COVID has taught us all on this planet, is we're all interconnected and interdependent. And within the financial sector, nothing is more true. As we've started off this briefing today, we talked about how interconnected and independent you are. So it's within an organization itself. You're interconnected and interdependent. The procurement department is interconnected to the IT department and the legal. They all depend on each other and how things operate within your organization. Then there's within the supply chain itself. So all of these parts, and then within the sector itself. So all of these pieces mean that we don't operate in silos. We have to take responsibility, but have that shared aim of raising the game across the entire sector. What's good for one is good for all. What's a risk for one is a risk for all. So that holistic approach is required. Upstream and downstream in the supply chain is key. Understanding that many times now when it comes to legislation and regulations, that you absorb that responsibility of dealing with the supplier. And this is upstream and downstream, as I say, depending where you fit within that supply chain. So it's very important that you understand where that risk is, what it is, and how it may be affecting your overall cyber risk levels. Quick example on that, guys, would be, let's say, for example, you have quantified your risk level at the moment as being a 3 out of 10. But when you take into account that you're relying on a number of key suppliers who have very poor cybersecurity, your risk level may shoot up to a 7 out of 10 when you aggregate that and put it together and see how that impacts your risk level, because you're dependent on them as part of your business model. So guys, the answer lies within. This is something I'm very passionate about emphasizing, is that I feel that the people you want to work on your cybersecurity risk program are the people that love and care for your business, i.e. the people that already work for your organization. To reiterate that point I made, if you've got 500 people working for your organization, there's 500 people that can protect you, that can care for you, that can understand that there is that shared responsibility to protect your organization from cyber threats. Empowering or individuals with and augmenting their skills with the right kinds of education is a key to success here. There's a shortage of cyber skills and resources around the world. There are over 6 million open cybersecurity jobs as I sit here and speak. And that reality means is that sometimes there's a very poor level of service available to be outsourced within organizations. So depending on these external providers is a risk in itself, especially when the people that understand how you operate, why you operate in a particular way, and why it's important to you, and your culture of your organization. These are all key aspects. So you're much better off identifying the key people within your organization that can help, that can assist, and that is effectively everybody to a certain level, with the right kind of augmented education. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about cyber governance and oversight. So how do we empower leaders within the organization? And we've talked about that from the perspective of meaningful metrics, making sure that the cyber strategy is aligned with the business strategy. Because leaders are they're used to the challenge of making decisions and risk-based decisions, but we need to give them the proper kind of information, intelligence-led information, so that they can make informed decisions. And that's key, because then going back to our cyber strategy infographic, we can understand that they can monitor and they can evaluate and they can direct the cyber strategy within the organization. So this is key in every organization. And if we look at how this was done, for example, in the United States of America, if we take a superpower, and how do they do that? Well, their leader effectively put out an executive order 13636 on February the 12th of 2013. And that was effectively to create what we refer to as the NIST cybersecurity framework. And this was to create an instrument, a tool that could be used by organizations right across effectively their ecosystem, whether it was nuclear power plants, whether it was critical national infrastructure, whether it was the financial sector, whether it was retail, aviation, large and small, right across. They set out this challenge from that executive order to be able to create something that, a commonality that could be used by everybody within that large and small, complex, unsophisticated, it didn't matter. And that is where the NIST cybersecurity framework itself was born from. So let's look under the hood at what this NIST, N-I-S-T, not to be confused with NIS, NISD, the NIS Directive Network Information Systems Directive from Europe. Completely different artifact and a completely different instrument. So what I'm talking about is the NIST, N-I-S-T, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And let's look under the hood of what that is. Well, it's made up of three core pieces. It's a risk-based approach to reducing cybersecurity risk, and it's composed of these three core components. There's a core, there's tiers, and there's profiles. So what the core is, that's the desired cybersecurity outcomes, organized into a hierarchy and aligned to more detailed guidance and controls. We have implementation tiers. They're a qualitative measure of organization cybersecurity risk and management practices. And there are profiles. They're the alignment of an organization's requirements and objectives and risk appetite and resources using the desired outcomes and of the framework core. So look, guys, let me break this down into a little bit of a simpler jargon. What we're talking about here is a really, really good approach to implementing cyber security framework within your organization, cyber governance and oversight. And the reason I am taking the opportunity to share this information around the NIST cybersecurity framework with even a senior audience such as yourself is because it is utilized by over 90% of organizations around the world. And the fact is that when you reverse engineer most regulatory compliance in the financial sector, it is reverse engineered to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So understanding even the basic elements of NIST cybersecurity framework will bring you a long way to understanding what the expectations are from regulators, from the industry itself, and from the sector itself in how to deal with cyber risk and cybersecurity within your organization. So again, we talk about these cores, and it's made up of these 5 functions. Identify what assets are there. Protect, what controls are in place to protect the assets. Detect, are you able to detect those kind of control, those kind of incidents and things that are happening? Are you able to respond? Are you able to recover? So these 5 high-level functions are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And you'll often see this in some referred to often as IPD or. So you may see that acronym sometimes within regulatory compliance. And indeed, for those of you, even recently, I was doing some work around in Bermuda in the financial sector, in the insurance sector, and there's a piece of legislation from the Bermuda Monetary Authority referred to as the Code. And the Code is a reverse engineer of the NIST cybersecurity framework. It breaks it down into 3 areas instead of 5 and so on. But the Bermuda Monetary Authority, the BMA, acknowledge the fact that it's based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. And it's great to see that. It's great to see people leveraging something as valuable and useful as a NIST cybersecurity framework to build out frameworks that can be used ubiquitously around the world and in different sectors for organizations of all different sizes and complexities. So this is what the framework core looks like. I won't dwell too much on this, but just to give you an idea that when we break down those core functions, they're broken into categories, they're broken into subcategories, and those subcategories are effectively what we call outcomes. That's effectively statements of what good looks like. So that's effectively what you're trying to achieve within your organizations. And they relate those to what we call informative references. And informative references are information references in other standards. So for example, the ISO 27001, and it will point out which control and which aspect of that is relevant to that subcategory within this cybersecurity framework. So what it means is, getting back to our nexus of controls, getting back to our translating our touch points, this is what this is, guys. This is saying, hey, if you're able to use this, straight away you're able to map and you're able to identify it in at least 5 other frameworks. And of course, those 5 other frameworks are well managed, and standards are well managed and mapped to other frameworks and so on. So here is how you start translating into other areas. Now, all of these elements, all of these functions can be performed concurrently within an organization and not necessarily implemented in a serial way. So in other words, you can implement identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover in a concurrent way right across your organization. You don't have to start with identify and work all your way to recover. So let's look at a summary of what each of these core functions are. So identify, that is about what processes and assets need protection in your organization. The protect function, what safeguards are available. Detect, what techniques can identify incidents. Respond, what techniques can contain the impacts of an incident. Recover, what techniques can restore your capabilities. So let's look at this, the core being used as a translation layer or a communication layer within your own organization. Because again, I've already alluded to this about that communication challenge we have when dealing with the board or the board dealing with the rest of the business. So if we look at this, we have senior executives, we may have specialists in other fields within the organization. And it creates that translation layer between those because it's a specific, the specialists in other fields may have specific focus around outside of cybersecurity. There may be financial analysts and experts around risk and operational risk. They may have a specialized vocabulary or no risk vocabulary at all. Whereas senior executives would have this broader enterprise considerations and they will have an abstracted risk vocabulary taken from the various aspects of the business. And the NIST core gives them a common way of communicating. For example, what are we doing around the identify function? Where are we on the protect function? Where are we in the respond, recover functions? So it gives this commonality and this common way of communicating. And then, of course, you have your implementation operation levels within an organization. And they may have deep technical considerations. You might be dealing with IT security. You might be dealing with a network architecture. And they may have a highly specialized vocabulary. And again, the core is able to act as a translator, to be able to act as this intermediate communication level in talking in one specific way about all of these topics across the organization. And of course, it gives us this lateral communication between the specialist fields and the implementers. And it's very, very successful at that. This is another view or another aspect, and I don't mean to have you daunted by what looks like the complexity of the subcategory identification pieces here, but it's just to give you an idea of what this looks like. It's actually quite straightforward. There are 5 functions, there are 23 categories, and there's 108 subcategories and 6 informative references related to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So that's how the numbers work. And you can see this, for example, going from identify, it leads into what are the subcategories and what are the informative references within the identify key function. So that's the anatomy of the NIST cybersecurity framework itself. Now, very quickly, I just want to give you a flavor of how the NIST cybersecurity framework may be implemented within your own organization. So again, we have these areas within the business. We may have the senior executives, we may have the business process level, and of course we've got the implementers and the operational level within the organization. So when implementing the NIST cybersecurity framework within your organization, obviously the focus of the senior executive level will be around organizational cyber risk. They may have actions that they carry out, such as expressing the mission priorities. They may approve the implementation tier selection level, and they will direct the decisions of what's going on. So that's the premise of what the senior executive level are doing within the implementation. They would set the mission priority and the risk appetite, and of course the budget. That would be taken down to a business process level. They would create the framework profiles, and the framework profiles are, you can almost think of those as what are the appropriate maturity levels for the organization. So we're at a current status level, and we've got a target implementation tier level, and what would those look like? And the gap between the two are what we'd often refer to as a roadmap for improvement. So you can think of these as almost, I hate using the phrase gap analysis, but it's a gap between your current profile and your target profile of where you feel you should be. And of course, then you can report back on the implementation progress. Any changes in the assets or the vulnerability and threats can be reported back to the business process level. And that business process level, of course, can articulate those changes in the current and future risk back up to the senior level. So we're informing and we're empowering, and this communication loop is happening within your organization. Another fantastic benefit of implementing the NIST cybersecurity framework within your organization. And again, it becomes this commonality language between regulators, between other standards and other regulations and business requirements around the world. So one of the key things that people often think is that there's a magic bullet when it comes to cyber risk and cybersecurity, and that's either a piece of technology or it's a person. And that person sometimes is identified as the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. Well, CISOs come in all shapes and sizes and flavors, and they range from, we even have a maturity level around them to quantify the levels of CISOs there are, and there's 4 different kinds of CISOs. And a level 4 CISO generally would be in the salary range of over $1 million a year, and that is because they are very rare. And they are very capable individuals that go way beyond just one aspect of being a CISO itself within an organization. Now, the reason I am illustrating this rather busy infographic is simply just to outline how complex the area of being a CISO is. And that is why in most organizations, it's about creating a CISO function or a CISO office with these multidisciplinary aspects made up of a number of individuals rather than one particular individual. But if we look at this from the perspective of the CISO office, we can see that they have to handle budget, they have to handle security operations, risk management, identity management, legal and HR. They may be dealing with compliance and audits, security architecture, project delivery lifecycle, and of course business enablement and making sure that things are aligned with the business mission. So it's a rather complex area, and it should be understood and appreciated that it's worth evaluating whether the current individual that you think is your CISO, are they fit for purpose? Do they have the right qualities, the right experience? Can they deal with all of these aspects? Or does the business need to create a CISO office function and have that handled by multiple talents and resources within the organization? So now in this segment, we're going to look at understanding the G7 cyber fundamentals for leaders. So where do these come about? Well, first of all, the G7 is a group of 7 countries, and they get together on a regular basis, and they talk about the most important things that they see in the world and how to deal with those challenges and those aspects. So back in around, I think it was 2015, over $100 million was taken from the Bangladesh Central Bank, and this was a wake-up call for the G7, and they recognized that this was often referred to in the media as a SWIFT hack, but the SWIFT payment system itself was not compromised. This was a different weakness that was exploited. But what it highlighted and what it underpinned was that interconnectedness and that interdependence between elements of the financial sector and the fact that there could be this cascade or contagion effect to a compromise of some of the key elements of the entire system, financial sector system, and how it operates, and the trust that people have in it, and organizations and individual brands within that sector too. So they developed what's referred to as the G7 Cyber Fundamentals, and this is basically key fundamental advice for the leaders of the financial sector. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just walk through each of those elements so we can gain a better understanding of the key aspects and the key parts of that document. So there are a number of elements that they require, and they're broken down here. We can see them. There's cybersecurity strategy and framework. There's governance, risk and control assessment, monitoring, response, recovery, information sharing, and continuous learning. And that's what makes up all of the fundamental elements of the G7. And the reason I have a pyramid document on the right hand side is because I want to remind or inform those that wouldn't be aware of the different levels of documentations that generally are required within any kind of a cyber security management system itself, often referred to as an ISMS, Information Security Management System. And effectively, you're looking at 4 different levels of documentation. So from the top level, we would have, policy, and then level 2, we would have things like, the procedures, and level 3, we'd have the work lists and instructions and how things are done. So in other words, we may have a policy on change management, and we may have in level 3 the instructions and checklists on how change management is carried out. Now, the reason I'm going through so quickly through the first 3 levels is because I want to focus your attention on level 4. And level 4 is evidence that you do what you say you do. So as I walk you through all of these elements now of the fundamentals of the G7, I want you to consider, could you prove that you do what you say you do? Because where the proof comes from, for example, is, do you have minutes of meetings that you say you have? Do you have training records? Do you have logs proving, that changes occurred within an environment, and the rollback plans, and so on and so forth? So this is all about creating those artifacts. So it's quite, I won't say straightforward, but it's easier for people to create the policies and procedures within an organization, or adapt templates and put those in place. But what a regulator is looking for is evidence that you do what you say you do. So it's easier to display a policy and say, this is our policy, and here's how we handle this aspect of it, or here's our incident response policy. It's another thing to be able to show evidence and proof that you're doing that. If I give you a real mundane example, I like to give simple examples when talking about controls, because it just helps, clarify it in the mind of the listener. And if we had a control, let's say, for example, that people had to sign in to an office when they arrive into the office, and record that they, in a sign-in log, that they have access to premises. Well, the evidence, the level 4 document, is that logbook where people signed in. That's the artifact that an auditor would be looking for, a regulator or any third-party auditor would be looking for, to prove that you do have a sign-in procedure. So it's creating evidence that you're operating the control and you actually do what you say you do. So now let's look at each of the individual fundamentals. Element 1. Entities in the financial sector should establish cybersecurity strategies and frameworks tailored to their nature, size, complexity, risk profile, and culture. So here, guys, we're talking about some of these areas we've already covered. A cybersecurity strategy, having a framework, perhaps something based on the NIST cybersecurity framework, tailored to your nature, size, complexity, risk profile, and culture. Your inherent risk level is what we're talking about there. So the purpose of a cybersecurity strategy and framework is to specify how to identify, manage, and reduce cyber risks effectively in an integrated and comprehensive manner. So this is what we're trying to do by putting together a cyber strategy and a framework to support that strategy. Element 2 is governance. Consistent with their missions and strategies, boards of directors or similar oversight bodies for public entities or authorities should establish the cyber risk tolerance for their entities and oversee the design, implementation, and effectiveness of related cybersecurity programs. So here we're getting back into our cyber strategy infographic, where we're talking about being able to oversee and be able to monitor and to design the appropriate strategy and the relevant framework that would be associated to support the strategy being put in place. So this is absolutely key around governance. Cyber governance is the effective governance structures reinforce accountability by articulating clear responsibilities and lines of reporting and escalation. Effective governance also mediates competing objectives and fosters communication among operating units in information technology, risk and control related activities. So here we're talking about collaboration, guys. We've already talked about this a number of times in the different segments, and we're talking about effective governance will encourage and foster that whole area and will mediate anything around any competing objective. So it's very important, again, getting back to our analogy of the car where we had the steering wheel, to have that oversight and governance and making sure the right pieces are talking to the right aspects in the business, and operating an effective cyber risk framework. Element 3 is a risk and control assessment. As part of an enterprise risk management program, entities should evaluate the inherent cyber risk or risk absent of any compensating controls presented by the people, processes, technology, and underlying data that support each identified function, activity, product, and service. Okay, let's break that down. Here we have it being called out specifically, your inherent cyber risk. You need to calculate that. So that is the risk absent of any compensating controls. So it's effectively, what is your raw risk? Of course, we've already talked about understanding what your risk tolerance is. But this is the risk, the inherent risk based on the people, the processes, and the technology. And based on, effectively, what we're talking about here is your business value chain, the underlying data that supports each of the identified functions, activities, products, and services. Element 4 is monitoring. Now, when they talk about monitoring, they're talking about the management system, the policies, procedures, as well as technical monitoring. It's about making sure that your framework and operations are working, as well as monitoring the actual environment itself too. So effective monitoring helps entities adhere to established risk tolerances and timely enhance or remediate weaknesses in existing controls. Testing and auditing protocols provide essential assurance mechanisms for entities and public authorities alike. So again, to emphasize, this isn't just about putting in something like a log management system, monitoring an environment and monitoring alerts and activity on your network. This is a very important part of this, but it's also monitoring your security program, measuring it with internal audit and so on, and external audits to make sure that these things are happening. So not just technical aspects, but the management program and people and processes as well. Element 5 is response. As part of their risk and control assessments, entities should implement incident response policies and other controls to facilitate effective incident response. And again, if we think back to the NIST cybersecurity framework, and having that whole response function in there as well is really, really key. And it's a great way to implement and make sure that you're hitting element 5 here in relation to being able to respond to an incident. Element 6 is recovery. Once operational stability and integrity are assured, prompt and effective recovery of operations should be based on prioritization of critical economic and other functions and in accordance with the objectives set by the relevant public authorities. So depending on your size and complexity within the financial sector, of course, this would depend on that burden or that overhead that you have in relation to the priority of what needs to come back and when. But the whole concept and spirit of recovery is about being able to recover your business back in an adequate fashion. All too often, and sadly there's lots of anecdotal evidence there where organizations were able to maybe go to a recovery site or be able to recover through their disaster recovery plans, but weren't able to effectively then bring back the business to full operation because they had never tested or even conceived of that as the challenge, and it is obviously a huge part of the challenge. Element 7 is about information sharing. Sharing broader insights among entities, between entities and public authorities, and among public authorities deepens collective understanding of how attackers may exploit sector-wide vulnerabilities that could potentially disrupt critical economic functions and endanger financial stability. This is key to be part of leading international organizations and local, even sector groups, where information sharing through networks is very, very important. Because if we network, as we say in ICTTF, it takes a network to defeat a network, and if you're able able to have that trusted ability to have a two-way street in relation to intelligence sharing. And remember what intelligence is, guys. There's information sharing and intelligence sharing. Intelligence is actionable information. So something that people can action against. And it's one of our greatest weapons against the bad actors and the cyber threat actors is to be able to be forewarned, understanding what their modus operandi may be, their objectives are, and protecting the rest of the sector. And element 8 is about continuous learning. Entity-specific as well as sector-wide cybersecurity strategies and frameworks need periodic review and update to adapt to changes in the threat and control environment, enhance user awareness, and to effectively deploy resources. So we're talking about a number of things here, guys. We're talking about understanding that the business needs to learn about itself and cyber risk as it goes on. So that's what continual assessments. But also that the key people and stakeholders within the organization need continual education as well and need to be able to learn and develop and augment their skills. It's not just up to the IT security department. It's not just a cyber department issue. It's about all of the key stakeholders within the organization understanding. And of course, lots of organizations around the world and in the financial sector benefit from having certified cyber risk officers on their board, in their senior leadership team, and within their business leadership resources of the organization so that they can be empowered to do their jobs more efficiently and effectively. So in this segment, we're going to look at cyber resilience, and we're going to look in detail at 10 key actions organizations can do in order to increase their cyber resilience. These 10 key actions are based on all of the topics we've talked about thus far, and they reinforce some of the key salient points we've made, and they take into account the cyber risk impact of COVID-19 itself. So let's first look at creating a culture of cyber resilience. This is so important in organizations that they acknowledge the importance of a proactive cyber risk management. So let me explain that a little bit more. Reactive cyber risk management is obviously reacting to when things happen. Anticipating and acknowledging that things will happen is about being proactive with your cyber risk management. So a culture of cyber resilience is accepting the fact that incidents will happen and making sure that you've got the ability to minimize their impact and maximize your ability to recover from those incidents. And I've already mentioned during our briefing one particular document, which is the ECB's minimum expectations around cyber resilience and oversight and governance. And that's definitely a document worth reviewing from your perspective in the financial sector as a guideline, as the minimum expectations of what a regulator such as, and entities such as the European Central Bank may look for when it comes to cyber resilience. So acknowledging the importance of being proactive around cyber risk management is key. Establishing cyber resilience governance within your organization is something that regulators want to see. They want to make sure that you have appointed somebody that is responsible around this area. They want to make sure that you've gone beyond just the level of compliance and the minimum expectations, that this is something that has been taken seriously and is owned by the organization, and that it's related to the level of security risk and cybersecurity risk to the organization itself. And cyber resilience is something that can strengthen behavior right across the culture of the organization. And that's what you're trying to do here. And remember, policy dictates culture within an organization. So you need to have your policies well thought out, implemented, and all policies go through a procedure that we often refer to as CRAP, C-R-A-P, yes, create, review, approve, publish. And that's what you want to be able to create your policies that all affect cyber resilience within your organization. Make sure they're reviewed to be appropriate, make sure they've been approved, and make sure they're published and understood by those who are going to use and operate them. And it's the policy that dictates the operational culture of an organization. Now, you need to make risk-informed decisions. So you shouldn't be dealing with subjective terms such as, oh, we think that is high risk or that is low risk, unless there are meaningful metrics. And again, to rewind and revise what we talked about, meaningful metrics are that everybody should understand and know how those metrics are made up, what data points are used in them, what impacts them, and they can't be just magic numbers that appear and nobody really understands what those numbers are made up of. That's as plain as I can explain it, guys. Everybody should really understand the integrity of the metrics, understand that they are relevant and that they are smart metrics at the end of the day. So make risk-informed decisions. And this is what we obviously refer to as CRQ, cyber risk quantification, leveraging meaningful metrics that the business can relate to, and I say business, the business leaders can relate to and can understand, and take that zero trust approach that you want to validate things. If somebody's showing you some glossy PowerPoints with lots of charts on them, or sending you a 200-page PDF with lots of manufactured charts and dashboards from some sort of super cybersecurity tool, validate them. Where did these numbers come from? What did they mean? How are they garnished? What assumptions did they take in coming up with these metrics? Very, very important that you make truly risk-informed decisions. Now, you can't do everything, so the reality is that we need to focus on our critical assets. We need to enforce the basics of cyber hygiene. So cyber hygiene is the phrase around the basic side of cyber controls that should be put in place. So the reality is that most cyber threat actors use unsophisticated or pedestrian kind of techniques in order to circumvent vulnerabilities within an environment. And therefore, that if we use basic cyber hygiene, like making sure systems are patched, making sure, yes, we use layered defense like anti-malware. Yes, we use complex passwords. Yes, we use two-factor, multi-factor authentication. These are basic components of cyber hygiene, and they are so effective. Cyber education. All of these things are basic parts of cyber hygiene, and these are the things that give you more bang for buck. They protect you in more of a way than those other more expensive, more sophisticated mitigation techniques and products and services that affect that top tier end of the threat landscape. Monitoring. Absolutely key, especially now that so many of people operate remotely into our environments, that we have effective 24/7 monitoring. I mean, we see this with the modus operandi of ransomware attacks and so on, that they'll come in after hours or over bank holiday weekends, and this is effectively what they're at. So what you need to be able to do is make sure that no human can watch your environment and all of those hundreds of thousands of transactions that are going on a network level and protocol level within your environment from arguably thousands of devices and endpoints. So you need to have effective monitoring in your environment on a 24/7 basis to understand what exactly is happening and to be able to alert you to what you need to know about, and not be able to just become a form of white noise, but to be able to alert on those prioritized events that are based on intelligence-led feeds. So identity and access management is absolutely somewhere where you should be focusing in your organization. Given the remote access implications of COVID and that impact on all our business models, we need to up our game around identity and access management. This is absolutely key to make sure that what we had in place pre-COVID may now not be adequate for how we're operating our models. We're allowing suppliers, customers, vendors, and so on enter our environments, and we need to be able to monitor and handle all of that through an identity and access management system, again, 24/7. And automation. I've mentioned a few times during our briefing that we're dealing with a cyber skills crisis, and the skills that are out there are very, very expensive. So anything that can be automated should be automated, and use the specialist resources effectively and efficiently within your organization. Update as you transition to the new normal. Again, to remind you that I used a phrase such as cybersecurity is a journey, not a destination. This isn't something that we're going to get and say, hey, we're there, guys, we have cybersecurity. This is all about understanding that every day is a new normal. So we have to update this. We're not working in a temporary environment at the moment. This isn't that we don't have that ability to be able to think that this is something that's going to end at a particular date and then we can go back to the way we were pre-COVID, essentially. So with COVID, the impact of cyber risk from COVID, this is certainly something that I really encourage organizations to do, is to make sure that they have updated their new business models, their new cyber strategies, their asset inventories, their software inventories, and so on, to make sure that they're updating all of the relevant documentation as they're transitioning. You're not waiting for a particular event to happen. You need to do this now. So test and challenge any assumptions that are made. And this goes across the board, guys, in relation to any of the technologies that are being used. You can't just presume because something is a brand name that it is secure. You have to be able to test and validate any of the assumptions you're making with suppliers, with products, with services, with individuals, and so on. And have a crisis management plan in place. Because again, this is a lesson from COVID where so many organizations just weren't able to deal with the crisis that came upon their organization dealing with this. But there are lots of different kinds of crisis. I mean, and in relation to cyber, there's lots of different levels of crisis you may be dealing with. But having an effective communications plan, having an effective crisis management plan is a absolute imperative, and it's the most valuable thing you can have at hand when something goes wrong. And things will go wrong. There will be attacks. There will be some successful attacks, and it's about being able to deal with those kind of things. So anything that develops up from tabletop exercises, from desktop exercises, all the way through to even wargaming, and being able to develop those instant response plans and crisis management plans and communications plans, absolutely key for your organization. And identify your business value chain. Again, I have mentioned this a number of times during a briefing, and this segment serves as almost a revision piece of the previous segments we've gone through, because it gives me the opportunity to explain again how important it is that we understand our cyber DNA. We understand our business value chain. We understand what business, legal, and regulatory requirements we have to adhere to in relation to cyber security, risk, and privacy, and all of the compliance aspects around that. And that's about, knowing yourself, knowing your organization, knowing what digital assets are important, and being able to make sure that everything is aligned from that perspective. Calculate your inherent cyber risk. We're all unique, guys. We're not all the same. All businesses are unique. Every organization, there's no two banks the same, no two credit unions the same, no two organizations the same around the world. So those unique characteristics that are based up, and we talked about in the G7, that inherent cyber risk piece is you can see it obviously within lots of legislation from even the FFIEC. Even I mentioned earlier on about the Bermuda Monetary Authority, and they refer to it as a proportionality principle, and making sure that you're basing things on the proportionality of risk within an organization. So it's absolutely a key in dealing with any regulator or third-party auditor that you're able to demonstrate that the actions you've taken for managing risk is based on your inherent cyber risk. And identify your current controls, and of course have evidence that those current controls are in place. So here where we're looking at the inherent risk of this individual jumping out of the airplane without a compensating control or a control mitigating control put in place is death, but the control they have in place is a parachute. So, that's what you want to be able to identify. What controls you have based on the risk that is before you. And being able to prove that, getting back to our level 4 documentation, guys, can you prove the control is in place and that it's operating and it's producing evidence that it's effective? And establish metrics, measure to manage. Understand where you are, where you need to get to, whether it's a current status profile to a target implementation tier profile within the NIST cybersecurity framework, whether it's a maturity level that you want to get to. Understand what those metrics are and make sure that they're understood collectively between your collaborative team that's dealing with cyber risk across your organization, and measure to manage. It's not something that you do once a year. It's something that should be done very regularly to make sure that things are improving, because we all know the cyber risk landscape itself is dynamic and it's changing, and you need to be able to make sure that you have the relevant kind of controls put in place. By way of an example, you should be able to, for example, measure, do you have the appropriate controls in place to deal with an influx of ransomware attacks? And that's something that you should be able to articulate and be able to explain, yes, we have the following controls in place, and these are the controls we have for dealing with ransomware. So ransomware being very prevalent and very much on the radar of organizations, you need to be able to measure those kind of things and say, yes, here's where we are in relation to that. And collaboration is key, guys. Again, I'm re-emphasizing some of my key salient points and learning objectives as we go through these segments. And collaboration is a key to success. Making sure you have all the relevant stakeholders identified that would take part, for example, we refer to them as auditees within maybe a cyber risk assessment, making sure that everybody understands their role, that the participation is valued, and that they can all make a difference in relation to protecting your organization. And they all have a crucial part to play. And that is it. And again, I want to emphasize, you shouldn't rely on outsourcing this. You can delegate but cannot abdicate responsibility. And it is key. The CEO is responsible for cyber risk and the board are accountable. And update your strategy and be brave. I mean, the world is changing all the time, not just with the impact of COVID, but we see this with increased digitalization, geopolitics, everything else. And there's going to be lots of challenges, lots of problems, lots of crises that every business comes across as we go forward. So it's about updating your business strategy, your cyber strategy, and making sure you're as effective for your organization as you can be as you progress towards developing and implementing your business and your cyber strategy. And remember, a key point, digitalization will continue to accelerate. This is an absolute given. So there's going to be more of this, more dependence on the digital architecture, the internet, both from a consumer point of view and a business point of view. And those who will survive are those who get cyber risk management correct and do a really good job at establishing digital trust with their customers and their business partner base and their own business value chain and their own supply chain. So it's absolutely key that, from a digital risk perspective and a cyber risk perspective, all of those things are being handled very, very well within an organization. And within all of this change, there will be opportunities you can identify to make your business more effective, to deliver better and enhanced services to your customer base, and indeed make things much more efficient within your organization. And a lot of these things can be done through the use of appropriate controls being put in place, reduce the risk, increase the performance and the efficiency, and deliver those services to the organization. That's a key part. And those who are responsible for cybersecurity, cyber risk, and privacy within an organization are key players in being able to implement and empower a business to be able to deliver on any of those opportunities that are identified. And my final point, guys, as I finish up here, and thank you for your time on this briefing, and I hope you've enjoyed it, but education is key. Knowledge is power. And at ICTTF, we have a number of training programs that we work with financial service companies around the world in delivering those. And indeed, we've partnered with organizations such as the International Compliance Association in delivering and empowering and supporting the financial sector around the world. And they range from our cyber risk specialist course, our cyber risk officer course, and our NCSE based on the NIST cybersecurity framework itself. So thank you for your time and your focus on this, and I hope you've enjoyed the briefing, and we hope that we can engage and help you in the future in dealing with cyber risks.